Silas Crowder didn't knock. He never knocked. He shoved the door open so hard it cracked against the walnut spints, letting a blast of December air cut straight through the cabin like a blade. Clara Whitlock was still holding her husband's burial cloth in her hands. When he walked in, didn't wait for the body to cool, didn't wait for the grief to settle, just stood in her doorway with his hat still on and said, "You're done here. Sundown. Both of you." She looked at him. Her mother looked at him. Nobody moved. "You heard me," he said. And just like that, in 38 words spoken to a grieving widow in December, with temperatures already dropping toward 35 below zero, everything was gone. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, not strong enough, not small enough, not the right kind of person to deserve a place in this world, stay with me. Because this woman's story will wreck you and rebuild you at the same time. Subscribe now, hit that like button, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far Clara's story travels. Now let's go back to that doorway. The morning Thomas Whitlock died, Clara had been awake for 31 hours straight. She didn't cry right away. That wasn't something people understood about her. She processed things slowly, like a deep river that looks calm on the surface, until you step in and realize the current that has been pulling at your ankles the whole time. She sat beside his cot, with her big hands folded in her lap, watching the rise and fall of his chest slow down, then stop. And she didn't make a sound. She just sat there in the cold dark of the cabin while her mother slept in the back room, and she held his hand until it wasn't warm anymore. Thomas had been sick for 3 weeks. Fever that started as a cough turned into something that shook his whole frame, then hollowed him out from the inside. The settlement doctor, if you could call a man with 3 medical books and a fondness for whiskey a doctor, had told Clara in the 2nd week that there wasn't much to be done. She'd asked him what that meant exactly. He'd looked at her the way men in Asheville Crossing often looked at her, like he was calculating the weight of her body against the value of his time, and said, "It means pray, Mrs. Whitlock." She hadn't prayed. She'd made broth and changed compresses and slept in her chair with one ear open, and she'd done that every day and every night until there was nothing left to do. The burial happened fast. The ground wasn't fully frozen yet. In the upper field it would be by Christmas, so 2 men from the settlement dug the grave, took the 2 coins Clara pressed into their palms, and left before supper. She didn't ask anyone to come. She knew better. In Asheville Crossing, a woman like Clara had learned that invitations to her life were rarely accepted with warmth. She was 29 years old. She was built wide and solid. Always had been her grandmother had been the same as strong as a post and twice as stubborn. Clara's hands were large enough to palm a full-grown rooster, her shoulders broad enough that Thomas used to joke she could carry the cabin itself if she needed to. She hadn't always hated her body. There had been years when she'd thought of it as a tool, something useful, a body that could work. But Asheville Crossing had spent 4 years teaching her to see herself through the town's eyes, and the town's eyes were not kind. Too much of her, people said. Not with their mouths, rarely with their mouths, but with the way they looked past her in the general store, with the way their children stared until their mothers pinched them, with the dark, with the way the other women of the settlement talked just loudly enough at Sunday meetings that Clara could hear the words heavy and burden, and why does she even bother? She'd built up a callus around it, the way you build a callus around any wound that won't stop being touched. She stopped flinching. She learned to move through those eyes like she didn't feel them. Thomas had never looked at her that way. That was probably why she'd married him. She was still inside that grief, the quiet, motionless kind, when Silas Crowder came through the door. She heard him coming before he arrived. Crowder was the kind of man who announced himself through sound boots that hit the ground like he wanted the earth to know he owned it, voice that carried before the words formed. He was the chairman of the town council, a tall man with a narrow face and a way of holding his chin that suggested he'd decided your value before you opened your mouth. He had 3 cattle, 2 deputy landowners, and a grudge against anyone who hadn't bent the knee to him in the last decade. He didn't knock. Clara was sitting at the table, Thomas's burial cloth folded in her lap, when the door swung in. Her mother, Mabel, was in the back room. Clara heard the old woman's cot creak. She'd been resting since morning. Her joints always worse in cold weather, but she didn't come out. Maybe she heard Crowder's boots and knew. Crowder looked around the cabin the way a man looks at properties already decided he owns. His eyes moved over the table, the hearth, the tools on the wall, the small sacks of flour stacked in the corner. He barely looked at Clara herself. Mrs. Whitlock. Not a question. Not a condolence. Clara set the burial cloth down carefully on the table. Crowder. I'll keep this short, he said. Thomas is gone. You know the settlement charter. The property rights on this parcel were held jointly under marital registration, with no male heir to transfer. Thomas has been dead 14 hours, Clara said. Crowder paused, blinked, then continued. The council convened this morning and voted. Parcel reverts to settlement ownership under Article 9. You have until sundown to clear out what's yours. Clara stared at him. Not in disbelief she'd heard of Article 9. She'd heard Thomas mention it once, years ago, in the same way people mention a law they assume would never apply to them. But hearing it now, in her own cabin, with her husband's burial cloth still warm from her hands, felt like something physical, like a door slamming in her chest. It's December, she said. I'm aware of the month. We're 72 hours from a hard freeze. My mother is 70 years old. Crowder turned his hat in his hands. Not from discomfort, she could see that. It was a habit, a gesture he'd practiced until it looked like patience. The settlement can't be responsible for every widow who... I'm not asking the settlement to be responsible for anything. She stood up. She was not a tall woman, but she filled the room in a different way, and she could see Crowder recalibrate slightly, take a half step back. I'm telling you my mother is 70 years old, and it is December. There are options, he said. The Halverson family has said they might take in your mother as a domestic worker, for yourself. He paused. His chin went up. There are settlements further east that might suit your situation better. My situation, Clara repeated. You're not an asset to Ashvale Crossing, Mrs. Whitlock. I'll be plain about it since you seem to need plainness. You have no income, no male support, and with all due respect to the difficulty of your circumstances, you and your mother would be a burden on our winter resources. He said the word without flinching. Burden. Like it was a fact. Like it was a measurement, an objective assessment he'd arrived at through careful accounting. The council's decision is final. Sundown. He put his hat back on his head and left without closing the door. Clara stood there in the cold that poured through the open door, and she counted to 5 inside her head. It was a trick Thomas had taught her when everything inside you wants to break. Count to 5 and breathe. She made it to 3 before she walked to the door, closed it, and leaned her forehead against the wood for exactly 1 breath. Then she went to find her mother. Mabel Whitlock was sitting up in her cot with her quilt pulled to her waist and her white hair pinned back and her eyes already alert. She had the hearing of a woman who'd survived 70 years by paying attention. She'd heard every word. Well, Mabel said. Her voice was thin, but her eyes were sharp as ever gray blue and steady. The kind of eyes that had watched a lot of weather without blinking. What are you thinking? Clara didn't answer immediately. She sat down on the edge of her mother's cot and looked at her hands. Big hands. Scarred across the knuckles from years of outdoor work, thick through the palm. She turned them over and studied them the way you study a tool you're not sure will hold under pressure. He's right about one thing, she said finally. Mabel waited. We can't stay, Clara looked up. Not here, anyway. Then where? And this was the moment she'd think back on it for years. This specific second when she remembered a story Thomas had told her. He'd told it late, one night, winter before last, when the fire was low and they were both half asleep and he was in one of his wandering moods where stories came out of him like something had loosened. He'd talked about an old trapper, a man his father had known, who'd found a cave in the eastern face of Blackthorn Mountain. Not just a cave, a warm cave. Not naturally warm like a spring, but warm in a specific way, an underground way, something about the air that moved up through the mountain's guts. Trapper had called it Widowmaker Hollow because 2 men had died trying to climb to it in bad weather. But the trapper himself had lived there, Thomas said, through 3 of the worst winters anyone had seen. Clara had filed the story away the way she filed most stories, interesting, possibly useful, not urgent. It was urgent now. Blackthorn Mountain, she said. Mabel looked at her for a long moment. The old woman's eyes moved across her daughter's face like she was reading something. Then she said, That's 4 miles in December. I know. You've never been up that trail in snow. I know. You'll be pulling a sled. I know, Mama. Silence stretched between them. Outsides, the wind picked up. Clara could hear it finding the gaps in the cabin walls, the ones Thomas had never gotten around to sealing. Somewhere in the settlement, a dog was barking. Mabel reached out and patted Clara's hand. All right, she said. Then we'd better start packing. There was no time for despair. That was one thing about crisis, real crisis. The kind that has a deadline. It burned away everything that wasn't immediately necessary. Clara moved through the cabin with the focused speed of someone who had been preparing for emergencies her whole life without knowing it. Blankets first. Then the wool coats, the heavy ones Thomas had bought 2 winters ago. The flour 2 sacks, 20 pounds each, because whatever happened, you needed to be able to make bread. The tools from the wall, a hand axe, a short-handled hammer, a draw knife, flint and steel, and the extra candles, the cast-iron pot. She pulled out Thomas's old hand sled from behind the cabin. It was a solid thing, wood and iron, built for hauling timber, not people. She loaded it methodically, tying things down with lengths of rope, distributing the weight so it wouldn't tip sideways on a slope. The cow, their aging milk cow, a brown and white thing named Hester, she tied to the back of the sled with a long lead. Hester was not pleased about any of this. Mabel dressed herself. Clara didn't offer to help until the old woman's fingers fumbled with the coat buttons twice, and then she stepped in without making anything of it, buttoning the coat from bottom to top while Mabel held still, with the dignified resignation of someone who knew when to accept help and when to fight. He's going to come back, Mabel said, to make sure we went. Let him, Clara said. You're not angry. It wasn't a question. Mabel was reading her again. Clara thought about it. She finished the last button. I'm past angry, she said. Angry takes energy I need for the mountain. By the time she got Mabel seated on the sled, cushioned with 2-fold blankets, wrapped in a third, the sun was already dropping toward the tree line. They had 2 hours of light, maybe less. The temperature had been falling all day and would keep falling all night. People were watching them go. She could feel it, the specific weight of settlement eyes on her back, as she leaned into the sled harness and began to pull. She'd rigged a rope over her shoulders and across her chest the way a draft horse would be rigged, because that was what the situation called for, and Clara had long ago stopped letting embarrassment be a factor in what the situation called for. Nobody helped her. One woman, Mary Pressel, whose husband ran the tanning shed, called out from her porch. Clara, this is foolishness. You won't make it to the tree line before dark. Clara didn't stop pulling. She didn't turn around. Stay warm, Mary, she said, and kept walking. She heard a few murmurs, heard someone say something with the word heavy in it, though she couldn't catch the rest. Heard a child ask its parent where the fat lady was going. Heard the parent shush the child but not correct it. She put her head down and pulled. The first 100 yards were level ground, snow-packed from foot traffic in the settlement paths. Not easy, the sled was heavy, Mabel was heavier than she looked, and Hester kept trying to stop and plant her feet, but manageable. Clara's legs found a rhythm, the same grinding, repetitive rhythm she'd used for every hard task in her life. One step, then another, and you don't think about how many more there are. You just take the one that's in front of you. Then the ground began to slope. It wasn't much at first, just enough of an incline to make her feel it in her calves, in the tendons behind her knees. But the snow was deeper here. Nobody packed this trail. Nobody traveled it in winter, and her feet began to sink with every step. And the sled's runners found less purchase on the uneven ground. And very quickly, 100 yards into the slope, Clara understood exactly what this was going to cost her. She stopped. Let her breath catch. For just a moment she could hear it, ragged and loud in the silence of the mountain approaches. The sun was lower. Mabel was looking up at her from the sled, face calm, mittened hands folded in her lap. You know, Mabel said conversationally, like they were discussing the weather, I always thought you were stronger than any man in that settlement. Clara looked down at her. You're not helping. I know, Mabel said, but I thought you should know what I thought. Clara almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she readjusted the rope harness across her shoulders, set her jaw, and leaned back into the slope. She would not remember, later, how long the climb took. Time had stopped working normally by the second hour. What she would remember was the specific quality of the pain, the way her lower back began to scream first, then went quietly numb, then screamed again. The way her fingers inside their gloves stopped feeling like fingers and started feeling like objects attached to her hands. The way her breathing became the only sound she was fully aware of, that wet, burning rasp of air going in and coming out and going back in. She would remember the moment Mabel stopped talking. That was the first real alarm. Her mother was a woman who talked steadily, as long as she was conscious and relatively comfortable. The silence from the sled, the way it arrived suddenly, without Clara noticing that transitions, made her stop and turn around. Mabel's eyes were open but unfocused. Her lips had gone pale. Her mittened hands were still folded in her lap, but they weren't gripping each other anymore. They were just resting loose, the way hands rest when the body is pulling resources back toward the center. Hypothermia. Clara recognized it not from medical knowledge. She had none but from instinct, from the animal understanding of what a body looks like when it's running out of heat. Thomas's body, near the end, had looked a little like this, that same loosening, that same withdrawal. Mama. She grabbed her mother's face between both hands. Mabel's skin was cold. Mama, look at me. The old woman's eyes found her. Slowly. I'm fine, she said, but the words came out thick and blurred at the edges. You're not fine. Clara looked up the slope. She looked back the way they'd come. The settlement was invisible now. Too dark. Too much forest between them. There was no going back. Going back meant giving them exactly what they'd expected, a failed attempt, a returned widow, a burden that had tried and collapsed. She looked at the slope ahead. She made the decision without deliberating. She untied everything on the sled that wasn't essential, most of the flour, except for one 10-pound sack, the extra tools, the spare blankets she'd been saving. She piled them in a heap in the snow and didn't let herself mourn them. Then she undid Mabel's sled ties, worked her arms beneath her mother's shoulders and knees, and lifted. Mabel was not a large woman. But lifting a person is different from lifting weight. They shift, they unbalance, they aren't evenly distributed. Clara staggered once, caught herself, and then locked her legs and held. I'm too heavy, Mabel said into her shoulder. You're perfect, Clara said, and she started walking. She didn't know how far the hollow was. She had Thomas's story, and that was all an old trapper, an eastern face, warm air from below, a thing called Widowmaker Hollow. She walked upward through the dark, and the cold, and the burning in her arms, and the ache in her chest that was partly air and partly grief and partly fury, and she did not allow herself to stop. And then through the trees, through the dark, through a break in the rocky face of the mountain that she almost walked past, she saw it, a gap in the rock, black inside and deeper dark than the night around it, but no wind, where the wind had been cutting at her face from every direction for the last hour. Here, right here. At the mouth of this gap, there was nothing, more than nothing. There was something warm, something exhaling, very faintly, from somewhere deep below. Clara stood there for one full breath. Then she carried her mother inside. The warmth was real. That was the first thing Clara confirmed, not with her hands, not with a thermometer she didn't have, but with her face. She stood just inside the mouth of the gap and turned her cheek toward the dark interior of the mountain and felt it, a faint, steady exhale of air that was measurably, undeniably warmer than the air outside. Not warm like a room, not warm like a fire, warm like something alive, buried deep in the rock, breathing slowly upward through channels and cracks and ancient hollow spaces that had been there long before anyone had given this mountain a name. She didn't let herself feel relieved. Relief was a luxury that came after the immediate danger was handled, and the immediate danger was her mother. She carried Mabel deeper into the gap. It widened after the first 10 feet, the ceiling rising, the walls pulling back, and set her down against the rock wall as carefully as she could manage, which wasn't very carefully, because her arms had been shaking for the last quarter mile, and her legs were close to giving out entirely. Mabel made a small sound when her back met the rock. Clara pulled the remaining blankets from inside her coat. She'd stuffed 2 of them against her chest during the last stretch of the climb, using her own body heat to keep them from freezing stiff, and wrapped them around her mother's shoulders and lap. Still with me? Clara asked. Mabel's voice came back thin, but present. Still with me. Good, don't go anywhere. She went back to the entrance for Hester. The cow had planted herself 6 feet from the gap and was refusing to move, Which was not surprising. Hester had strong opinions about unfamiliar enclosed spaces, but Clara had been persuading stubborn animals since she was 8 years old, and she didn't have the patience tonight for a prolonged negotiation. She got behind Hester, put both hands on the animal's hindquarters, and pushed. Hester objected loudly. Clara pushed harder. After 30 seconds of this, the cow lurched forward into the gap and stood there in the dark, sides heaving, expressing her displeasure through her nostrils. "Thank you," Clara told her, and went back for the sled. Pulled it inside herself. The runners caught twice on rock, and then stood at the cave entrance and looked out at the mountain. The snow was still coming down, lighter than before, but steady. The temperature had dropped again since they'd left the settlement. She could feel it in the quality of the air on her face. That particular bite that moved past cold into something more serious. She thought about the flower she'd left in the snow 50 yards back down the slope. She thought about whether it would still be there tomorrow. So, whether the sack would survive the night intact, or whether the moisture would get into it and ruin it by morning. She'd worry about that tomorrow. Tonight, there was no going back down. She pulled a flat stone in front of the entrance, not to block it completely, but to cut the wind and turn to face the interior of the cave. It was dark. Not completely dark, there was some quality to the stone itself, a pale mineral, something in the rock, that caught the faint moon glow from the entrance and scattered it, just barely enough to see shapes. She could make out her mother against the wall. She could make out Hester standing in the middle of the still annoyed. She could make out the floor uneven, rocky in some places, but packed earth in others, and the ceiling, which rose in a rough dome above her head, and the walls, which curved back and away from her in ways she couldn't yet map. She reached into the sled for the candle tin and the flint and steel. Her hands were shaking badly enough that she dropped the flint twice before she managed to strike a spark. The candle caught on the third try, and the small flame made everything suddenly comprehensible. The cave was roughly the size and shape of a large root cellar, maybe 20 feet across at its widest point, narrowing toward the back where it appeared to continue deeper into the mountain through a lower passage. The walls were dry. That mattered enormously. Dry walls in December meant the cave wasn't a seasonal flood channel, which meant it was probably livable. Stone earth she found in the back corner, she almost missed it, because it had partially collapsed and been covered in debris, and what looked like animal scat from years past stopped her cold. She held the candle closer. It was clearly man-made. Someone had stacked granite slabs in a rough semicircle against the back wall, creating a fire basin, with a raised back section and what had once been a chimney structure angling up toward a natural crack in the ceiling. It had collapsed at some point. The upper section had fallen in, and a pile of rubble lay in front of it, but the base was intact. The firebox itself was intact. Someone had lived here. Clara crouched down beside the hearth and ran her fingers along the granite slabs. They were smoke-blackened. The soot in the cracks was old dry, deep years of fires, maybe decades. She looked up at the ceiling crack and traced the angle of it with the candle's light. Crack went straight up through the rock for as far as she could see, widening slightly as it went. A natural chimney. Whoever had built this hearth had built it specifically to use that crack as a flue. "You found something," Mabel said from across the cave. "A hearth. Someone built a hearth in here." She heard Mabel shift. "Old?" "Very." Clara stood and swept the candle around the space more carefully now, looking with different eyes. That was when she saw the bundle in the alcove. It was wedged into a natural shelf in the rock wall, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and tied with a leather thong. The leather was brittle, it crumbled when she touched it, and the oilcloth had dried and cracked along its edges, but the center of the bundle was still intact. She peeled the wrapping open with careful hands. Firewood. 6 or 7 pieces of split timber, bone dry, sealed inside the oilcloth, like someone had deliberately preserved them. They were gray with age, but their weight was still solid, not punky, not rotted. And beside them, wrapped separately in a piece of cured hide, a small book. Not a book exactly, more of a journal. Thin, handmade pages bound between 2 pieces of flat leather and sewn along one edge with sinew. The pages were brown at the margins and fragile at the corners, but the writing inside was legible, a cramped and slanting hand that she could read if she held the candle close. She didn't read it all that night. There wasn't time. and her eyes were too tired and her hands too unsteady. But she read enough. The man who'd written it called himself Only R. Marsh. He'd found the cave the same way she had by accident, in desperation, in winter, pursuing a story someone had told him about warmth coming up from the mountain's belly. Spent 2 winters here, maybe 3. The journal's dating was irregular, and he'd recorded everything. Not in a dramatic way. Not in the way of a man who thought posterity would be reading. In the way of a man who was talking to himself because there was no one else to talk to. Precise, practical, occasionally irritated, sometimes lonely. But the important things were there. The warm air came from fissures in the mountain's lower geology, places where some deep thermal process pushed heat upward through channels in the rock. Cave itself collected this warmth inefficiently. You could feel it, but you couldn't fully benefit from it without the right structure. The hearth had been Marsh's solution, but not just any hearth. He wrote about it in detail with the fussy specificity of a man who had failed at it several times before getting it right. The firebox dimensions, the angle of the back wall, and most critically, the chimney opening. It needed to be tall and narrow, shaped specifically to create a strong upward draw, so that the natural warmth rising from below would be pulled upward through the structure and circulate into the living space, rather than simply rising and escaping through the ceiling crack. The wrong proportions meant smoke flooding the cave. He'd written about this too, in words that conveyed suffering with matter-of-fact bleakness. Nearly killed me. 3 days with my eyes swollen shut. Did not attempt another fire for a week. Clara closed the journal and sat back on her heels. Her candle was burning short. She had 4 more in the tin, and she needed to be careful with them. She looked at the pile of old timber, then at the collapsed hearth, then at the ceiling crack, then at her mother. "Mama," she said, "I need to rebuild this hearth before I can make a fire. And I need to do it right, or we get smoke instead of heat." Mabel considered this with the same expression she used for practical problems. What does the journal say? Enough. I think enough. You think? I think, Clara said. And she could hear the edge in her own voice, not at her mother, at the situation, at the impossibility of certainty. I don't know for sure. I've never built a hearth. I've watched it done. Thomas and I built the fireplace in the cabin together, but I was mostly... She stopped. Thomas. She pushed it down later. I was mostly following his lead. You watched closely, though, Mabel said. You always watched closely. It wasn't quite reassurance, and it wasn't quite flattery. It was just a fact Mabel had observed and now offered back. That was her mother's way. Clara took it for what it was. I need more stone, she said, and I need to work fast before this candle's gone. Stone was everywhere, which was the one uncomplicated fact of that night. Blackthorn Mountain was not short on granite. She worked in the dark cave by candlelight and later by the thin gray light that began filtering through the entrance as the night moved toward an early winter dawn and she moved stone. She dragged pieces that were too heavy for her in strict physical terms, which meant she had to roll them, lever them with a branch she'd brought on the sled, coax them with her body weight in ways that scraped her knuckles open and drove rock dust into her eyes. She dismantled the collapsed upper section of the original hearth and sorted what was usable from what was rubble. She consulted the journal twice more, crouching over it with the candle tilted close, mouthing the words to herself, and she reread the critical passage about the chimney opening dimensions until she could repeat it from memory. Mabel slept, which Clara was grateful for. Sleep was the body doing its own repair work, and her mother's body needed all the repair it could manage. Hester the cow had found a corner she was willing to tolerate and stood in it, generating a small but not insignificant amount of body heat, which Clara made a note to be grateful for later. By the time the candle burned to a stub, and she lit the second one, Clara had the base of the new hearth rebuilt. Not beautifully, she was not a mason, and the stone surfaces were uneven, requiring wedging with smaller rocks, and the overall structure looked rougher than anything Thomas would have been satisfied with. But it was solid. She rocked it with her hands, and it didn't shift. She stacked the old dry timber inside the firebox, took the flint and steel, struck sparks into the tinder. She'd brought shredded cloth and dry bark she'd pulled from a fallen branch at the cave's entrance. The fire caught. She watched the smoke. That was the only thing that mattered in this moment, not the flame, not the warmth, not any of it, just the smoke. Where was it going? The journal had been specific. If the proportions were right, the smoke would pull upward with force. If they weren't, it would curl down and fill the cave within minutes. For 10 seconds, she wasn't sure. The smoke seemed to hesitate, to billow slightly at the firebox opening, and Clara's heart dropped straight through the cave floor. Then the draft caught. She heard it before she saw it, a sound like a low exhale, a steady pull, cave itself suddenly breathing in a new way. The smoke lifted, snapped upward, through the chimney opening and disappeared into the rock crack above with a decisiveness that made Clara press her hand over her mouth. The warmth reached her face before she expected it, not just the direct heat of the fire, but something underneath and behind it, the mountain's own warmth now drawn through the hearth structure and circulated into the space, mixing with the fire's output and building on it, layering. She turned toward her mother. Mabel was awake. She'd been watching from her spot against the wall, watching her daughter, not the fire. And when Clara turned, the old woman's eyes were bright and wet. "There," Mabel said softly. "There you are." Clara looked away. She looked at the fire, because looking at her mother right now would use up something she needed to save. "We need more wood," she said, "and we need water." That became the structure of the days that followed. Needs. Immediate, concrete needs. Each one presenting itself in order of urgency, each one requiring a response, and the discipline of responding one problem, then the next, was the thing that kept Clara's mind from dwelling in places she couldn't afford to dwell. The morning after their first night in the cave, she went back down the slope to retrieve the flour sack she'd abandoned. It had survived mostly. One corner of the sack had taken on moisture and would need to be used first before it turned, but the bulk of it was dry and intact. She carried it back up the slope on her shoulder in 35 below air, with her breath coming out in hard white clouds, and she noticed, on the way back, that the effort was slightly less than it had been the night before. Not because she was stronger, because she knew the route now. Knowing the route mattered. The fresh water came from a slow seep in the cave's back passage, the lower tunnel that continued deeper into the mountain. Explored cautiously on the second morning, moving with a candle held ahead of her, following the warm air that moved more strongly the deeper she went. The seep emerged from the rock wall about 40 feet in, dripping steadily into a natural basin in the stone floor. The water was cold but not kept liquid by the cave's internal temperature, and it tasted clean, with a mineral sharpness that she got used to quickly. Carried it back in the cast iron pot and boiled it before they drank it, because she wasn't sure, and being sure cost nothing. She found the coal on the third day. She'd gone deeper into the back tunnel than she had before, pushing past the seep and around a tight corner where she'd had to turn sideways to pass through, and she'd come out into a second chamber, smaller than the first, with a lower ceiling and walls that were different in color, darker, striated with a dull black luster in places. She touched the wall, and her fingers came back dark. She held the candle close and looked at the ceiling, at the floor, at the veins of black running through the gray rock like dark rivers, and she understood what she was looking at. Not a rich seam, she wasn't looking at a mine, but enough, more than enough for a winter's heat. She went back to Mabel with black hands and explained what she'd found, and Mabel made the sound she made when something surprised her, but didn't completely surprise her, a small upward exhale, and said, "The trapper knew, didn't he? That's why he built here." Clara hadn't thought about that. She went back and read more of the journal and found the passage she'd missed the first time, found fuel in the lower chamber. Not inexhaustible, but more than adequate. Combined with timber and the natural heat from below could sustain a person indefinitely, or for several years at minimum. The mountain provides what it provides. I have stopped asking why. She didn't know what to do with that for a moment, that last line, the weight of it. And then she closed the journal and got back to work. The food stores she found on the 5th day were not food she'd expected. They were in a sealed clay pot, wedged into a niche in the cave wall, behind the hearth, and she'd missed them during her initial reconstruction because they'd been tucked behind a slab she'd mistaken for structural rock. Pot's clay seal was still intact, which was remarkable, and when she cracked it open, she found dried meat strips of it, dark and hard and smelling of smoke, and something herbal and dried berries packed in fat and 2 fist-sized cakes of hardtack that had calcified to the consistency of small bricks, but were still when she brought one down on the cave floor with the hammer. Food. Old food. Very old food. She brought Mabel a small piece, and they considered it together. "Eat it?" Clara asked. Mabel put it in her mouth and chewed carefully, working her jaw against the resistance. "It's food," she said finally. "It's dry, and it was sealed, and it doesn't taste wrong. I've eaten worse." "When?" 1847, Mabel said, and left it at that. They were careful with the old stores. They supplemented them with flour porridge from the cast-iron pot, and with Hester's milk small amounts. The old cow was not producing generously in the stress and cold, but every day she gave something, and with a broth Clara made from dried meat, boiled long and slow. It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough by the hollow feeling in her own stomach she got used to ignoring. By the way, Mabel's collarbones began to show more clearly above her coat collar, but it was what there was, and they were alive. She began improving the cave in the second week. She packed clay collected from a deposit in the back tunnel, near the seep, where the rock gave way to a deep pocket of reddish earth into the gaps in the cave walls, sealing out the mountain air that had been finding its way in through small crevices and creating cold spots in the floor near the entrance. She built a second, smaller wall of stacked stone just inside the entrance gap, creating a kind of airlock lobby that reduced the wind intrusion substantially. She improved the hearth by adding a curved back, played a flat piece of granite she'd found near the lower chamber entrance, and dragged up through the tunnel, with her body bruised and sweating that, redirected more heat outward into the living space. She recorded all of it in the margins of the trapper's journal, using a charred stick for a pen and her own precise, slightly uneven handwriting in the spaces between his. Mabel watched her work with the careful attention of a woman who understood labor. "You know what you're building," Mabel said one evening, watching Clara pack clay into a wall gap with her bare hands. Her gloves had been soaked and were drying by the fire. "Shelter," Clara said. "More than shelter." Clara pressed the clay in and smoothed it. "Then what?" Mabel thought. "When I was young, your grandmother used to say that the difference between a roof and a home was intention. A roof keeps rain off. A home is something you make on purpose." Clara stopped, looked at her hands, red and cracked and caked with dried clay, looked at the wall, which was uneven and lumpy and completely, undeniably solid. "I'm just trying to keep us warm," she said. "I know," Mabel said. "That's what I mean." The hardest morning came in the third week. Clara woke before light. She always woke before light now. Her body had reorganized itself around the demands of the cave and felt wrong before she was fully conscious. A wrongness in the air. She sat up and looked at the fire, which had burned down to coals but was still alive. Good. She looked at Hester in her corner, still standing. Good. She looked at her mother. Mabel was breathing fast. Not the deep, slow breathing of sleep, but something shallower and quicker, like a bird's breathing, and her face was pale, even in the orange light of the coals. Clara was beside her in 4 steps, hand on her forehead. Fever. Not the burning, consuming fever that had taken Thomas, nothing like that, or not yet, but unmistakably elevated. The old woman's skin was dry and hot, and she stirred when Clara touched her, but didn't wake fully. Clara pulled the blankets tighter, put her own coat over her mother's legs, boiled water and got a wet cloth on her forehead, then sat there in the firelight with her jaw tight, watching the old woman's chest rise and fall, trying to calculate what she had and what she could do with it. She had willow bark. She'd found some on a tree at the cave entrance and stripped it on the second day as a general precaution, not knowing then that she'd need it, doing it because Thomas had always said you collected what you might need before you needed it. She made a strong tea from it and got most of a cup into Mabel, between the old woman's half-conscious protests. "Stop fussing," Mabel murmured. "I'll stop fussing when you stop having a fever. I've had fevers before. I know you have. I'm still here. I know that too." Clara wrung out the cloth and replaced it on her mother's forehead. Be still. She didn't sleep again that day. She packed more clay, brought up more coal from the lower chamber, improved the entrance wall, because stopping meant thinking about the fever, and thinking about the fever meant thinking about Thomas, and thinking about Thomas meant crossing into territory that she couldn't afford. She checked on Mabel every 30 minutes, the fever neither spiking nor breaking, hovering in that uncertain middle place that was better than worse and worse than better. By evening, the old woman's eyes were clearer. Hungry, Mabel said. Clara almost laughed. She made porridge. She put some of the dried berry mixture in it, which she'd been rationing carefully, and she sat beside her mother and watched her eat. You didn't sleep, Mabel said. I slept a little. Mabel gave her the look that meant she knew exactly what the truth was, but would only say so much. You can't work like this without sleeping. I know. Clara, I know, Mama. They sat in the firelight and listened to the cave, breathed that slow, warm exhalation from somewhere below that had become the background sound of their days, as familiar now as the sound of wind had been in the settlement. Hester shifted in her corner. The coal fire crackled with the specific low sound of coal, different from wood, more steady, less dramatic. I think I was wrong, Mabel said suddenly. Clara looked at her. About what? When you said Blackthorn Mountain. The old woman's hands moved in her lap, rearranging the blanket folds. I thought I was agreeing, because I trusted you. But I think part of me thought she paused. Started again. Part of me thought that we were going to die trying, and that at least we'd die trying, instead of accepting what that man said about us. Clara was quiet for a moment. And now? Mabel looked around the cave at the rebuilt hearth, at the sealed walls, at the organized sled contents, at the journal sitting on its flat rock shelf, with its margins full of new notes. Her eyes came back to her daughter. Now I think you actually knew something I didn't, she said. That's not something I say easily. I know. Your father used to say I was constitutionally unable to admit when someone else was right. He said that about me too. Mabel smiled a small, tired, genuine smile. Well, we're related. That was the closest thing to warmth they allowed themselves that night. Not the cave's warmth, not the fire's warmth, but the warmth of two people who had known each other long enough to not have to explain themselves, sitting together in a hollow inside a mountain while the worst winter in a decade howled outside, alive and fed, and considerably more comfortable than either of them had any logical right to be. 3 days later, Clara made her first serious mistake. Windows were dark. She'd been excavating a better passage, widening the tight corner, where she had to turn sideways using the hammer and a rock chisel she'd improvised from a hardened piece of coal seam. The work was slow and produced a lot of dust, and required her to work in a cramped position that put strain on her lower back, which had never fully recovered from the climb. She'd been at it for about 2 hours when she struck a section of wall that sounded different hollow, almost. A different note from the hammer blow, and without pausing to think adequately about what that might mean, she hit it again. Harder. The wall section gave way. Not the whole wall. A section about the size of a large bucket, just enough to open a gap. Cold air poured through it, not the cave's internal warmth, but outside air. Real winter air. And Clara understood in the same instant that she was looking at an exterior weakness in the mountain's rock face. A thin section that connected to the outside, and that she'd just punched a hole in their insulation. Its windows were dark. In the sudden cold draft, with rock dust in her hair and her hammer in her hand, and said something she would not have said in front of her mother. Then she started fixing it. It took most of the rest of that day. She packed the gap with clay first, as much as it would take, working fast, because every minute the cold air flowed in was a minute the cave's internal temperature dropped, and the temperature drop would reach the main chamber before long. She reinforced the clay with flat rock pieces mortared together with more clay, and reinforced those with a wooden brace, the last good length of timber she'd been saving for fuel, wedged horizontally across the gap. She sealed the edges with another clay pack and smoothed it flat with her palm. By the time she was finished, her coat was soaked through with sweat, and the cave air had dropped noticeably in temperature. She built the main fire up with fresh coal, more than she normally used, and sat close to it, letting the heat work back into her core, listening to the draft begin to reestablish itself through the hearth chimney. I heard the crash, Mabel said, from her blankets in the main chamber. I made a mistake, Clara said. Did you fix it? Yes. Then it's just a mistake, Mabel said. Not a catastrophe. Clara put her head back against the cave wall and looked at the ceiling. There was a smear of coal dust across us. She'd never noticed before it had been there since their first fire, probably. The smoke of those initial burns leaving its mark in the stone. Permanent, she thought. The cave would carry that mark, for longer than either of them would be alive to see it. She thought about what Mabel had said, not a catastrophe. She thought about Silas Crowder's face when he'd said the word burden, the complete absence of doubt in it, the confidence of a man who had measured something and arrived at a number and closed the book. She thought about the flour she'd loaded onto the sled, tools on the wall of the cabin, Thomas's burial cloth on the table, the feeling of the cabin door against her forehead on that last night. None of that was here. None of it had followed her up the mountain. What was here was the rebuilt hearth and the sealed walls and the coal seam and the journal in the margins of which she was writing things down, adding to something that had existed before her and would exist after her, a record of what this mountain could provide to someone willing to do the work. She wasn't building a temporary shelter anymore. She understood. She had been building something else entirely, and she had only just now recognized it for what it was. She reached for the journal, turned to a fresh margin, picked up the charred stick. She wrote, Week 3. Cold wall has been repaired. Mistake made, mistake fixed. The fire draws well, and the temperature in the main chamber is steady. We have enough coal for 6 weeks minimum, possibly more. Mother's fever has broken. We are still here. She looked at that last line for a long moment. Then she wrote underneath it, We are not just surviving. We are becoming something we weren't before we climbed this mountain. I don't have a name for it yet. She closed the journal and put it back on its shelf. Outside, the wind was doing what winter wind did to a mountain methodically, without malice or intention, just pure force applied to everything in its path. Inside the cave that the dead trapper had built and that Clara had rebuilt and improved and sealed and filled with warmth, the fire burned with its low, steady coal sound, and the mountain breathed upward through its ancient fissures, and 2 women who had been told they were a burden to everything around them sat in the center of all that warmth and remained exactly, stubbornly, furiously alive. 4th week began with a sound Clara hadn't heard in so long. It took her a moment to identify it. Knocking. Not the mountain sounds. Not the deep settling groans the rock made when the temperature trough outside dropped sharply. Not the crack of ice forming somewhere in the upper cave passages. Not the slow drip of the seep in the back tunnel. This was a fist against stone, tentative, then more insistent. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. Clara was on her feet before she was fully awake, the hand axe in her grip by instinct, positioning herself between the cave entrance and her mother. Mabel was sitting up, eyes sharp. Not alarmed, the old woman had a remarkable capacity for waking from sleep directly into full alertness, a skill earned over 7 decades of frontier living. At each other. Human, Mabel said quietly. I know. The knocking came again. Then a voice male, rough with cold, the words slightly slurred by what might have been exhaustion or might have been something worse. Hello? Is someone? We saw the smoke. Coming from the rock. We saw smoke. Clara didn't move immediately. She stood with the axe at her side and ran through what she knew and didn't know. She knew that no one from Asheville Crossing had come up the mountain to help her. She knew that people on the frontier who were desperate enough to climb Blackthorn Mountain in December were probably genuinely desperate. She knew that letting strangers into a space you'd built in a winter like this one was a calculation with no clean answer. She also knew that she had, on a specific evening 4 weeks ago, been the person on the other side of a door. Step back from the entrance, she said loudly. How many? Pause 2. Just me and my wife. We don't have anything. We're not a threat, ma'am. Step back 10 feet and I'll look. She heard boots in the snow. She shifted the flat stone she used as a door, the improved version, heavier now. Seated in a clay lip she'd built to make it fit properly, and looked through the gap. 2 people. A man, younger than she'd expected from the voice, maybe mid-20s, with a frost-rimed beard and clothing that was inadequate for the temperatures. In a way that was almost painful to look at a work coat instead of a proper winter coat. Boots that had never been treated for deep snow. Beside him, a woman roughly the same age, smaller, wrapped in what appeared to be a blanket over a dress, her feet in heavy socks inside overshoes that had failed comprehensively. She was leaning against the man in a way that suggested she was leaning because she needed to. They were not threatening. They were barely standing. Clara opened the entrance. The man's name was Edmund Prater. His wife was called Nell. They'd had a cabin in a small homestead claim 4 miles north On the Blackthorn's lower slopes, not a settlement. Just the two of them and what had been, until 3 days ago, a functional winter shelter. The fire that took it had started while Edmund was out checking his trap lines, and Nell had gotten out with her life and a blanket and nothing else. By the time Edmund got back, the cabin was a shell of black timbers in the snow. Clara let them in. She put them near the fire and gave them hot water and watched them get warm in the slightly desperate way people warm themselves when they've been cold for long enough that their body has stopped believing warmth is possible. Edmund kept looking around the cave. He couldn't help it. His eyes moved from the rebuilt hearth to the sealed walls, to the organized supplies on the sled, to the journal on its shelf. The look on his face was the look of someone recalculating something they thought they understood. "You built this?" he said finally. "Rebuilt it," Clara said. "Someone built it before me. I made it work. It's warm in here." He said it almost accusingly, like the warmth was something he needed to reconcile with what he'd expected to find. "That's the intention of a shelter," Clara said. Mabel made a quiet sound from her corner that might have been a suppressed laugh. Nell hadn't spoken yet. She was holding the tin cup of hot water in both hands, with the focused attention of someone for whom the cup was, in this moment, the entire world. She was pretty in a worn-out way, dark circles under her eyes, hair that had escaped its pinning and gone wild from the wind. When she finally looked up, it was at Clara, and her expression was complicated relief and shame in roughly equal measure. "We heard about you," Nell said, "in town." "People said—" "I know what people said," Clara told her. Nell nodded, looked back down at her cup. They were wrong. It was not an apology. It wasn't grand enough to be an apology. But Clara received it as what it was, an acknowledgement from someone who was herself a woman, who understood something about how towns talked about women, and she moved past it. "You'll stay until the worst of this breaks," Clara said. "We don't have abundance, but we have enough. You'll earn your keep. There's work to do." Edmund looked up. "What kind of work?" "I need timber from the lower slopes. More than I can pull up alone. And there's a section of the back tunnel I want to widen. Coal seam in the lower chamber would be easier to access if the passage were larger." She looked at him steadily. "Can you work?" He straightened slightly. He was a man who'd needed to be asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Then don't call me ma'am." Clara, that night with 4 people and a cow in the cave, which raised the ambient temperature noticeably, 4 bodies being better thermal infrastructure than 2, Clara lay awake, after the others were asleep, and looked at the ceiling with its old smoke smear and thought about what had just happened. She'd made a choice. She'd let them in. And she'd done it not because she was certain it was wise, not because she'd calculated the resources and found a surplus, but because she'd been standing at a closed door herself, and she decided that the kind of person she was going to be inside this mountain was not the kind who forgot what that felt like. That decision had costs. She knew it had costs. The food stores, already thin, would be thinner with 2 more mouths. The firewood she'd accumulated, what Edmund could bring up, would be consumed faster. The careful balance she'd established between what they needed and what they had was going to be disrupted. She turned it over in her head the way she turned hard things over, without flinching from the edges. Then she went to sleep. Edmund was, as it turned out, a man who knew how to work and knew how to take direction without making it about his pride, which Clara had not entirely expected and was grateful for. She showed him the coal seam on his second morning, holding the candle ahead of them. As they moved through the back tunnel, she'd widened the tight corner substantially over the past weeks, and he was able to get through without difficulty, and she explained what she needed. He asked 2 practical questions, nodded, and got to work. By the end of the day, he'd filled 3 of the large canvas bags she'd improvised from sled lashing material with coal from the seam and dragged them back to the main chamber. Nell, once she'd slept for a solid 14 hours and eaten 3 meals, turned out to have a specific and very useful knowledge. She'd grown up on an apothecary's claim and knew a fair amount about medicinal plants. Not a doctor's knowledge, practical and passed down, and full of the gaps that practical knowledge always has but real. She looked at the willow bark Clara had been using and approved it. She looked at the clay deposits in the tunnel and asked if she could make a small vessel from them, explaining that properly fired clay could hold heat differently than stone, could be used for different preparations. Clara gave her the go-ahead and watched, with genuine interest, as Nell fashioned a rough but functional small pot from the tunnel clay and fired it slowly in the hearth coals over the course of 2 days. Mabel and Nell found a natural rapport that Clara wouldn't have predicted. The old woman and the young one sat together by the fire. In the evenings, Mabel talking and Nell listened with the quality of attention that people give when they're absorbing something they know they'll need later. Mabel talked about rationing, not the deprivation kind of rationing, but the intelligent kind, the calculation of what a body actually requires versus what it thinks it wants, and how to stretch a supply without destroying the nutrition in it. She talked about fermentation, about preservation, about the specific gravity of different foods, and which ones kept, and which ones didn't. Clara listened too from her side of the fire while she worked on whatever needed working on that evening. She'd started making a more systematic record in the journal, not just notes, but something approaching a guide, written in the margins and between Marsh's lines, wherever space existed, overflowing onto pages she made from flattened pieces of the oilcloth inner layer. She was writing down everything she'd learned, everything Mabel said, the hearth dimensions, and the clay ceiling technique, and the coal seam location, and the water seep, and the temperature differences in different parts of the cave. All of it in her slightly uneven charcoal script. Edmund noticed her writing one evening and watched for a moment without saying anything. "What is that?" he said finally. "Record," Clara said. "Of what?" "Everything." She turned the page so he could see the diagrams she'd made rough but precise, indicating the hearth cross-section, the chimney angle, the dimensions that Marsh's journal had specified and that she'd confirmed through her own experience. If we get out of this winter alive, other people are going to face winters like it. They should be able to build what we built. Edmund looked at the diagrams for a long moment. He was not, she'd come to understand. The stupid man, his initial impression of inadequacy, the wrong coat and the failed boots, had been circumstantial, not constitutional. He read slowly, but he read, which was more than most men she'd known could say. "That's the fireplace," he said. "Yes, those are the proportions." "Exactly." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. She couldn't name it precisely, but it was a shift in the category he'd assigned her to, and she noted it without making anything of it. People updated their assessments when they had to. It was fine. She wasn't here to be assessed. "Could be valuable," he said. "That information." "That's why I'm writing it down," Clara said. The crisis came on a Thursday. She'd lost track of the exact date. She'd been counting days by notches in the cave wall, but had missed 2 days during the worst of Mabel's fever, so she knew it was Thursday only because Edmund said so, and she took his word for it. She'd gone down the slope alone to check a snare she'd set among the lower trees. Not a system she'd had much success with, but worth maintaining, and when she came back up toward the cave, she saw them. 4 men, standing at the cave entrance. Not Ashvale Crossing men, she didn't recognize any of them, which was information of its own. They were dressed for deep winter, all 4 of them, in good coats and heavy boots, and they had the particular stillness of men who were making a decision about whether to go in. Clara stopped. She was 30 yards below them on the slope, partially obscured by the tree line, and none of them had seen her yet. She had the hand axe in her belt and the snare rope in her hand, and approximately 4 seconds before one of them turned and spotted her. She used 2 of those seconds to assess. Big men. Armed, she could see the rifle on the largest one's back. Not settlers, or not recently, they had the weathered look of men who moved through country rather than staying in it. Trappers, maybe, or men who'd been pushed off their own claim by the winter. Or men who'd heard some rumor about warmth in the mountain and had come looking for what they could take. She used the last 2 seconds to decide that she was not going to approach 4 armed men alone, and that she was also not going to stand in the tree line indefinitely. She put 2 fingers in her mouth and whistled 3 short bursts, the signal she'd established with Edmund 4 days ago when he went for timber runs, meaning trouble at the entrance. Then she walked up the slope openly, not fast, not slow, making no attempt at concealment. The largest man turned when she was 15 yards out. He had a broad face and small eyes, and an expression of recalculation very similar to the one Edmund had made on his first day, but with different arithmetic behind it. "Morning," Clara said. She kept walking. She stopped when she was 8 feet from the entrance, which put her between the 4 men and the cave, and stood with her hands loose at her sides. The hand axe was in her belt on the right side, where she could reach it in less than a second. She didn't reach for it. "You're a long way up." The large man studied her. "That's yours?" He jerked his chin at the entrance. "That's mine. Smoke," he said. "Saw it from the low pass. Figured someone was squatting." "Not squatting," Clara said. "Built." He looked at the entrance, then at her, and she could feel him making the calculation. This woman, this size, alone. She let him make it. In her experience, men who made that calculation quickly made it wrong, and wrong in useful ways. Then the entrance stone shifted and Edmund came through with a piece of split timber in each hand and about 6 feet of height and a set of shoulders that had been built by actual physical labor over actual years. He came out and stood beside Clara without a word. The arithmetic changed. The large man's expression didn't collapse. He wasn't that obvious, but it adjusted. He looked at Edmund, looked at Clara, looked back at the entrance. "Just looking for shelter," he said. "Cold out." "It is," Clara agreed. "There's a settlement called Ashvale Crossing, 4 miles down and south. They have buildings. Heard there's shortages down there. Then go further east." He held her gaze for another 5 seconds. She held it back, with the specific quality of stillness she developed over 4 weeks inside a mountain. Not aggressive, not frightened, just completely solid. Like the cave walls, like granite, like something that had been here before he arrived and intended to be here after he left. He turned and said something to the other 3 men. They exchanged words she couldn't quite catch. Then he looked back at her, reset his hat on his head, and said, "Warm travels." Then they went back down the slope. Clara stood at the cave entrance until they were out of sight in the tree line. Then she let out a slow breath that she'd been holding in the back of her throat without fully noticing it. Edmund was looking at her. "You were going to stand there alone." "I wasn't alone. I signaled you before I got out." Yes, he was quiet a moment. "That was a risk." "Everything up here is a risk," Clara said. "You pick the one with the best odds and you commit to it." She turned back toward the entrance. "Thank you for coming out." He followed her inside. "You knew they'd see me and reconsider." "I thought they might." "What if they hadn't? Then I'd have needed the axe and hoped for the best." She said it flatly, without drama, because it was the truth and drama didn't change the truth. Edmund made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something less comfortable. They didn't tell Mabel and Nell the full version of what had happened. Nell didn't need it, and Mabel would have known that Clara had been standing in front of 4 men with an axe in her belt and would have spent the next 3 nights not sleeping properly. And Clara needed her mother sleeping. It was in the days that followed that second incident, the fever, the broken wall, the 4 men, on the slope, that something shifted in how Clara thought about what she was doing. She had begun this as survival. Pure, immediate, animal survival. Keep Mabel warm. Keep herself warm. We live through the winter. The cave had been a destination, not a project. But somewhere in the accumulation of days and work and decisions, it had become something she hadn't named until now. She was building something. Not just for herself. Not just for this winter. She wrote that in the journal. Not the polished version, the rough version, the way the thought actually arrived. Fragmented and incomplete. For whoever comes after. If you find this, here is what I know. Here is what works and what doesn't, and what will kill you if you do it wrong. I am not an expert. I am a woman who survived a winter by paying attention and refusing to stop. Use what I learned. She reread that and almost crossed it out. Then she left it. The firewood situation became urgent in week 5. Edmund's trips down the slope had been productive, but the consumption rate for people, constant fire through the worst temperatures either of them had experienced, was outpacing accumulation. Clara made the decision to dig a cache at the tree line, a pit lined with flat stones where timber could be stacked and covered and preserved against the snow. It would mean a longer carry to the cave, but it would mean they could stockpile rather than hand-to-mouth the supply. It was while she was digging the cache pit down the slope from the cave, in the trees, working with the improvised shovel she'd made from a flat piece of coal-seam slate lashed to a stick, that she hit ice and went through it. Not catastrophically. The ice was over a shallow depression in the ground, maybe 18 inches deep, and she dropped through it to her knee before catching herself on the edge. But the water was real and cold, and her right leg was soaked from the knee down inside her boot, and she was at the tree line in December in sub-zero temperatures with a wet leg, and that was a situation that could become dangerous in minutes rather than hours. She pulled herself out, assessed the leg not hurt, just wet, and made the decision fast. She left the shovel in the snow and moved back up the slope at the best pace she could manage, which was not her best pace, because the wet boot was already beginning to affect her ankle's movement as the moisture worked toward freezing. She focused on generating heat through motion, pumping her arms, keeping her core engaged, refusing to slow down even when the slope steepened and her lungs objected. She made it back to the cave in 18 minutes. She counted because counting gave her mind something to do that wasn't panic. Nelsa saw the leg first. She said something short and got Clara seated near the fire before Clara had fully explained what happened, pulling the boot off with the efficient speed of a woman who dealt with cold injuries before. The sock came off and Nell examined the foot and ankle with her hands, pressing along the tendons. Not frostbitten, she said. Cold. Wet, not frostbitten. You moved fast enough. I know, Clara said. She was holding her foot toward the fire, feeling the awful pins and needles that came with blood returning. I know. Could have been worse. I know. If you... Nell. Clara looked at her. I know. Nell sat back on her heels and looked at her with an expression that was not quite exasperation and not quite respect, and somewhere between both. You're not easy to worry about. Good, Clara said. Save it for something that needs it. It was Mabel who said the thing that lodged itself in Clara's chest and stayed there. It was that same evening, after supper, flour porridge with dried meat crumbled through it, which Mabel had improved substantially by adding a small amount of the fat from the old clay pot, rendering it into something that actually tasted like food rather than paste. And the four of them were sitting in the warmth of the main chamber, the fire burning with its steady coal sound, Hester making her nocturnal noises in her corner. Mabel had been quiet through the meal, quieter than usual, which meant she was working toward something. Clara knew her mother's silences the way she knew the cave's sounds. Each one had a particular texture. Edmund, Mabel said, how are things in the settlement? Edmund looked up. He'd been to Ashvale Crossing twice, since joining them both times for supply information, scouting what was available, and he came back each time with the specific expression of a man who'd seen something uncomfortable. Bad, he said. Getting worse. The Crowder stock didn't last. He'd overcounted before winter, apparently. The granary's lower than anyone's saying publicly. There are two families in the tanning shed building together because they couldn't heat their own cabins separately. And what do they say about this place? Mabel asked. Edmund glanced at Clara. Different things. Some people think, he paused, picking his words. Some people think you've got gold or stores you're hoarding. Some people think that you found something valuable. Both true, Clara said, just not the gold part. Some people are angry, Edmund said. They think it isn't fair, that you're, I don't know, comfortable. Up here. We're not comfortable, Nell said. We almost died twice. I know. I'm just saying what they say. The fire crackled. Mabel folded her hands in her lap. What do you want to do? The old woman said to Clara. Clara looked at her. What do you mean? You know what I mean. She did know. She'd known since Edmund first described the situation in the settlement, and she'd been sitting with it the way she sat, with things she hadn't yet decided, turning it over, testing the edges, checking for the honest center of it beneath the anger and the history and the memory of Crowder's face when he said, burden. Nothing makes me obligated, Clara said. They sent us out. They made a decision. That's true, Mabel agreed. Crowder said we were a burden. He said we'd slow them down. He said the settlement couldn't afford us. Also true. And now they're struggling, and they want... Clara stopped. Started again. I don't know what they want. I don't know that they want anything from me specifically. They just want to not be cold and not be hungry. That's what everyone wants, Nell said quietly. She wasn't looking at anyone. She was looking at the fire. We did. We just needed somewhere that wasn't going to kill us. The silence held for a minute. Hester shifted. The coal settled in the firebox. I'm not doing it for Crowder, Clara said finally. No one said you had to, Mabel replied. I'm not doing it because I feel sorry for them. Good. Pity is a bad reason to do anything important. Clara looked at her mother. Then what's the right reason? Mabel thought about it with the same seriousness she applied to everything. Because you can, she said, and because you've already decided what kind of person you are inside this mountain. Doing it for the right reason just means being consistent. That was the truest thing anyone had said in the cave, and Clara received it the way she received truths that cost something without looking away, without letting it land softer than it was. She thought about the journal. She thought about all the pages she'd filled with everything she knew, every technique, every measurement, every mistake and correction. She'd written it for whoever came after. She'd said so in those words, in the journal itself. Well, the whoever came after was apparently going to be sooner than she'd expected. She began making preparations the next morning. She didn't make a speech about it. She didn't announce anything. She told Edmund and Nell what she was thinking and got the response Edmund's practical, Nell's immediate and warm, and then she sat down with the journal and began making a condensed version of the most critical information. Not the whole thing. The whole thing took time to understand, and most people in crisis didn't have time. But a short version, how to build the hearth, the chimney dimensions, the coal, the seep, the basic principles of what made this cave livable. A document someone could follow in a day. She was still writing it when the second group of visitors arrived. These ones knocked properly, 2 knocks, then a wait, then 2 more, which felt almost formal given the context. Clara opened the entrance and found herself looking at a woman she recognized, Martha Lund, who ran the settlement's laundry operation with her husband. Behind Martha was a teenage girl, her daughter, Clara thought, though she'd never learned the girl's name, and an older man she didn't know, who was leaning on a staff and had the hollow-cheeked look of someone who hadn't been eating properly for a while. Martha Lund had never been unkind to Clara. She hadn't been kind. Either she'd been one of the women at Sunday meetings who looked slightly past Clara rather than at her, a studied neutrality that was its own kind of message. Now she stood in the snow at the cave entrance with the dignity of a woman who'd walked 4 miles in December to knock on a door and was not going to let herself be small about it. Mrs. Whitlock, she said. Martha, Clara said. A beat of silence that held a large amount of unsaid things. We were hoping, Martha said carefully, that you might have some warmth to spare. Clara looked at the 3 of them, the woman, the girl, the old man with his hollow face and his staff, and then she looked back over her shoulder at the cave, at the rebuilt hearth with its steady fire, at Edmund and Nell and her mother watching from inside. She stepped aside. Come in out of the cold, she said. Mind the entrance stone. Martha Lund walked in and stopped 2 steps inside and stood very still, looking at the fire, feeling the warmth. Her daughter walked in and made a small involuntary sound, not a word, just a sound that came from a person whose body had been cold for a long time, meeting warmth it hadn't expected. The old man came in last and sat down heavily on the nearest flat rock and put his face toward the fire with his eyes closed. Clara watched them for a moment. She was not sentimental about it. She was not flooded with the particular golden warmth of a person doing a good thing and feeling good about it. What she felt was more complicated, cold clarity, a sense of things being in their right place, not because the world had righted itself, but because she had decided what her right place was, and she was in it. She went to the fire and began heating water. Mabel was watching her from across the cave. When Clara looked up, the old woman gave her a small nod, nothing more than that, just a nod, and Clara turned back to the pot. The water would take a few minutes to heat. There was work to do while she waited. Martha Lund's daughter was named Ruth. Clara learned this on the second day of their stay, when the girl finally stopped being silent long enough to answer a direct question. She was 14, dark-haired, with her mother's careful eyes and a quality of watchfulness that came from growing up in a household where watching was how you stayed out of trouble. She'd been helping without being asked, refilling the water pot, keeping the fire fed with the coal. Edmund showed her how to manage, checking on Hester with a natural ease around animals that Clara noted and filed away. On the second morning, Clara handed her the improvised shovel and showed her the clay deposit in the back tunnels and said, "Bring up 2 loads before midday." Ruth took the shovel without comment and went. Martha watched this exchange from the main chamber with an expression Clara couldn't fully read. "She's useful," Clara said, not unkindly. "She is," Martha said. And then, after a pause that cost her something, "She's been scared since October, when the food started getting short. She doesn't say so, but I can tell." "Children don't say so," Clara said. "They just get quiet." Martha looked at her hands. I should have said something. Before. To you. When Thomas was sick. She stopped. Started differently. We all knew what Crowder was going to do. After Thomas passed, we all knew. Nobody said a word. Clara was quiet for a moment. She was sealing a new section of wall near the entrance, pressing clay into a gap with her thumb, and she kept working while she considered what to say. What would you have said? I don't know. Something. That it wasn't right. Would Crowder have listened? Martha made a sound that was not quite a laugh. No. Then you'd have felt better, and nothing would have changed. Clara smoothed the clay flat. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying people tell themselves that speaking up helps, when mostly it just moves the discomfort around. She turned and looked at Martha directly. What would have helped is if one person had offered us their barn. 2 nights in a warm barn, and I could have figured out the rest. Martha held her gaze. I'm sorry, I know you are, Clara said. And she meant it not as forgiveness granted from a height, not as absolution, but as a simple observation. Martha was sorry. That was real. It didn't rewrite what had happened, but it was real. Drink your water while it's hot. The old man's name was Gerald Foss. He'd been in Ashevale Crossing longer than anyone 30 years, he said, which meant he'd been there before it was even called Ashevale Crossing, when it was just a collection of 4 families and a shared well. He didn't talk much in the first 2 days, spending most of his energy on the basic work of warming himself back up. On the 3rd day, he started talking and didn't really stop. He talked about the early winters he'd seen, about how the settlement had handled scarcity before not well. He said, not well at all. There'd been a bad season 15 years back where 2 families had starved outright, and nobody had discussed it after the fact because shame had sealed the subject. He talked about the charter that Crowder had used to take Clara's cabin, about how it had been written in the settlement's founding years, when the logic was that resources needed to be in the hands of people who could work them, and the assumption built into that logic was that working them meant being a man. Crowder didn't write that charter, Gerald said. But he keeps it because it keeps him useful. I know why he keeps it, Clara said. I think the council could be moved if someone pushed. The younger members, Holt and Birch, they weren't comfortable with what happened to you. I could see it in the vote. They voted with him anyway. Men vote with the room, Gerald said. Doesn't mean they believe what they're voting. Clara thought about this. She was working on the journal's condensed version, the practical guide she'd started for the Ashevale Crossing situation, and she set her charcoal stick down and looked at Gerald Foss with his 30 years and his hollow cheeks. Why are you telling me this? She said. Gerald met her eyes. He was a man who'd lived long enough to be past the performance of things. Because you're the one who's going to have leverage when spring comes. And I'd rather you know what you're walking into than be surprised by it. I'm not walking into anything, Clara said. I'm staying on this mountain. Maybe, Gerald said. But they're going to come to you. He wasn't wrong. They kept coming. Over the following week, the cave absorbed 6 more people from Ashevale Crossing, arriving in 1s and 2s, always with that same quality of controlled desperation, people who had waited as long as they could before admitting they needed to come. A young couple named Soren and Britta Halst, newlyweds who'd burned through their winter stores faster than they'd planned, and were too proud to say so until Britta's hands had gone numb twice in 1 day. A middle-aged man named Pete Cowan, who worked the settlement's mill, and whose wife had died in October from a fever that nobody had been able to treat. He arrived alone, with nothing, and sat by the fire for the first 12 hours, barely speaking. Clara managed the space with the same practical attention she'd applied to everything since the first night. She reassigned sleeping areas when new people arrived, moved supplies, adjusted the rationing. She established a contribution system. Everyone who was physically able worked. Not as punishment, not as a transaction. She never said you work or you don't eat, because that was Crowder's logic and she wasn't interested in it, but as a simple structural reality explained plainly. This place runs on labor. Here's what needs doing. Find your part in it. Most people responded to plain logic better than she expected. A few didn't. The problem arrived in the form of a man named Dale Shreve. Shreve came up with this couple. Though he wasn't connected to them, he'd simply followed them when he saw them heading toward the mountain, which was a thing Clara only learned after he'd been inside the cave for 2 days. He was 30-something, broad, with a manner that suggested he was accustomed to making other people uncomfortable. and finding it useful. He didn't introduce himself when he arrived. He walked in, looked around the cave with proprietary eyes, and sat down near the fire in the spot that Pete Cowan had been using. Pete, who was a quiet and unbothering man, moved without saying anything. Clara watched this from across the cave and noted it. Shreve ate what was given to him, slept well, and in the first 2 days did exactly enough work to avoid being directly addressed about it, not nothing, but close to nothing, the minimum that could be performed without triggering a confrontation. On the 3rd day, he began making comments, not at Clara directly. That wasn't his method. He made comments to the general air of the cave, in a voice pitched to be heard by anyone nearby, about the size of the portions, about how the coal supply would go faster with this many people, about how it was interesting, wasn't it, that one person seemed to be deciding everything for everyone else. The first 2 comments Clara let pass. She'd learned, over 4 weeks in close quarters with multiple people, that not every comment required a response. Some comments were smoke, not fire. They wanted a reaction more than they wanted a result. The 3rd comment happened when Mabel was within earshot. Mabel had been moving more slowly in the past week, not declining exactly, but her body was managing the accumulated effort of the winter in the way of a 70-year-old body with increasing economy, pulling resources toward the essential functions and releasing the ones that could be released. She tired faster. She rested more. Clara watched this with the particular vigilance she reserved for things she couldn't fully control and refused to be blind about. Shreve looked at Mabel crossing the cave and said, to no one specifically, that old woman uses more resources than she contributes. That's going to be a problem. The cave went very quiet. Clara set down what she was holding. She turned around. She walked to where Shreve was sitting, and she stood in front of him, and she didn't raise her voice, because she'd learned that a certain quality of quietness was more effective than volume. Get up, she said. Shreve looked up at her. He had the calculated look of a man deciding whether to test it. Get up, Clara said again. Same tone, same volume. He got up. You're going to walk to the entrance, Clara said. You're going to it's in for 10 minutes. You're going to go outside for 10 minutes. When you come back in, you're going to have decided whether you can be in this space without making comments about the people in it. If you decide you can't, you're welcome to go back down the mountain. If you decide you can, you're welcome to stay and work. She held his gaze. That's the whole conversation. Shreve stood very still for a moment. Something moved through his face, not quite shame, not quite anger, something in between that didn't have a clean name. Then he looked around at the cave, at Edmund, who was watching from the back passage entrance with the timber piece still in his hand, at Pete Cowan, who had the mild expression of a man who was quietly rooting for a specific outcome, at Martha's daughter Ruth, who was standing near Hester's corner with her arms crossed and her chin up. He went outside. He came back 11 minutes later and spent the rest of the afternoon hauling coal without being asked. Clara did not make anything of this victory. She went back to what she'd been doing before. Later that evening, Mabel caught her eye from across the fire and gave her the same small nod she'd given when Martha Lund walked in. Clara turned back to the journal. She'd been thinking about the condensed guide differently since Gerald's comment about leverage. Not because she wanted leverage, the word itself made her tired. It was the vocabulary of Crowder's world, of men who thought in terms of what they could hold over other people. But Gerald wasn't wrong that spring would bring a reckoning of some kind. The settlement would need to address what had happened to its vulnerable members, not because anyone felt strongly about justice, but because they'd all just spent a winter experiencing what happened when the people who were supposed to be weak turned out to be the ones who kept everyone alive. She wrote the guide clearly. Not with anger, not with I told you so. Built into the language, she was careful about that, rereading each section and pulling out anything that sounded like a score being settled. This was practical information. Hearth construction, chimney ratios, underground thermal principles, as she understood them from Marcia's journal and her own experience. Food preservation, coal identification, water sourcing in frozen terrain, how to read a cave for habitability signs, dry walls, upward air movement, the specific quality of a deep thermal current versus a surface cold draft. She wrote it as clearly as she could, in the plainest language she could manage, as if writing for someone who'd never thought about any of this before. and needed to be able to follow it in the dark. She was on the peat oilcloth. She'd run out of journal margins and was working on the oilcloth pages now when Pike Cowan sat down beside her. He didn't say anything at first. He was a man who moved into proximity with a topic the way you moved toward a fire when you weren't sure of your welcome gradually, leaving himself options. Clara kept writing. My wife used to write, he said finally. What did she write? Letters. To her sisters back east. She wrote long letters. He looked at the oilcloth page in Clara's hands. She said writing helped her make sense of things. Does it? Clara asked. She was genuinely asking, not being conversational. Pete thought about it seriously. I think it organizes things. Puts them in order. And order helps when things feel... He paused. When things feel very large. Clara looked at the page in her hands. Careful columns of measurements. The diagrams in charcoal. The notes about what failed and why. I'm not writing to make sense of things, she said. I'm writing so the information survives me. Pete was quiet for a moment. That's a generous thing. It's a practical thing, Clara said. But she thought about what he'd said, and she kept thinking about it after he'd moved away, and somewhere in the thinking she arrived at the uncomfortable recognition that the two things might not be as separate as she'd told herself. That maybe she was writing it down. She was writing it down because she needed the information to mean something beyond just this winter, beyond just this cave, beyond just her own survival. That maybe she was writing it down because Marsh had written it down, and his writing it down was the reason she was still alive. And there was a line of connection between her and that dead man she'd never met that ran through the very act of recording what you knew. She didn't write that in the journal. Some things you knew and didn't write. The hardest week came in late January. It was the coldest stretch of the winter. She knew it from the way the cold behaved differently, not just in degree but in quality. A pervasive, penetrating cold that found ways into the cave that previous cold hadn't found. The entrance gap was harder to seal. The clay she'd used on the walls contracted and developed new hairline cracks that let in thin fingers of outside air. Coal fire needed to run hotter and longer to maintain the temperature the cave needed, which consumed reserves faster. And Mabel got worse. It wasn't the fever returning. It was something quieter and harder to address, the old woman's body simply tiring. Not giving up, Clara refused to use that language even in her own head. Tiring, drawing inward. Mabel still talked, still ate, still maintained the watchful clarity that was her fundamental nature. But she was doing all of it from her blankets now, conserving the energy she had for the things that mattered. Nell monitored her daily, with the apothecary's knowledge she had, which was real but limited. She told Clara honestly what she observed. No acute illness, no specific crisis point, just the biology of a 70-year-old body that had spent 4 months of winter in conditions that would have taxed a much younger one. She needs the cold to break, Nell said quietly, when Mabel was sleeping. I know, Clara said. Spring, I know. She said it more sharply than she meant to. Nell didn't flinch, which Clara was grateful for. I know what spring would mean for her. I know. She sat with her mother every evening after supper. Others gave them space without being asked. The cave's social ecology had developed its own natural courtesy. People learning the rhythms of the space and each other without Clara having to manage it explicitly. During those evening hours, Clara and Mabel talked. About things Clara wouldn't have predicted, not about the winter, not about survival or the settlement or Crowder, about the past. About Clara's father, who had died when Clara was 11, who had been a large man with a large laugh and a habit of bringing home stray animals that Mabel always pretended to disapprove of. About the farm they'd had before Asheville Crossing, before Thomas, before all of this, a small claim in gentler country, with a creek that ran cold and clear from a hill that had its own internal warmth in winter, now that she thought about it. Like your mountain, Mabel said one evening. Clara looked at her. What? The hill above the farm. It was warm in a way that didn't match the season. Your father always said there was something alive in the rock. Mabel's eyes were half closed, remembering. I wonder sometimes if that's where you got the idea. Not from Thomas's story, from being small and knowing the hill. Clara didn't know what to do with that. She turned it over and couldn't reach the bottom of it, so she left it. Are you afraid? Clara asked her. She didn't qualify it. Mabel didn't need qualifications. The old woman was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Clara thought she might have drifted to sleep. Then of what comes after? No, a pause. Of leaving you alone in this? A little. But then I think about what I've watched you do in this cave, and the little gets smaller. Don't manage me, Clara said. Her voice came out rougher than she meant. Mabel made the sound that meant she was amused. When have I ever managed you? Constantly, Clara said. My entire life. That's called mothering. Different thing entirely. Clara looked at her mother's face in the firelight, the lines of it, deep now, settled in. The specific topography of a face she'd been reading since, before she had language for what reading meant. She wanted to say something that had the full weight of what she felt in it. She was not good at that. She was good at clay and coal and hearth proportions and carrying her mother up a mountain. She was not good at putting the important things into words. I wouldn't have made it up here without you, Clara said finally. Not because I needed you to carry anything. Because I would have turned back. If I'd been alone, I would have turned back. Mabel opened her eyes fully. That's not true. It is. I would have stood at the bottom of the slope and told myself there wasn't any point, and I would have believed it. She looked at the fire. Having you on that sled was the only reason I kept going. Because stopping wasn't an option when you were on it. Mabel was quiet for a moment. I wondered, she said softly, if I was dead weight. You were my reason, Clara said. Neither of them said anything after that. They didn't need to. The morning of the day Dale Shreve left, he found Clara in the back tunnel and told her he was going. He said it plainly, without the layered deflection of his earlier manner. Whatever had happened during his 11 minutes outside had done something real, even if it had taken 3 more weeks to complete itself. He said he had a cousin in a settlement 2 days east, and he was going to try for it before the next cold snap. All right, Clara said. I wasn't started. Stop. I wasn't useful here. I know that. You hauled coal. Not enough. She looked at him. He was not a sympathetic person even now. He was a man whose first instinct was to identify the weakest element of any situation and use it. And that instinct didn't disappear because he'd spent a month in a cave with people who refused to operate that way. But he knew it. That was something. Not everything, but something. Take 2 days' worth of the hardtack, Clara said. The old stuff. And follow the southern ridge. It's more sheltered than the direct trail. He blinked. Why? Because 2 days east in a cold snap is far enough that food matters. She turned back to what she'd been doing. Travel safe, Shreve. He left without further ceremony. Edmund watched him go from the entrance and then came back inside and said nothing, which was the correct response. Coal seam presented a new problem in week 7. Edmund came up from the lower chamber with a different expression than usual, not alarmed, but carefully neutral. The face of a man who'd found something he was working out how to present. The seam's changing, he said to Clara. He waited until they were slightly apart from the group. Changing how? It's narrowing. To the left. Where we've been working, mostly it's thinning out. The rock's different, lighter, less black. We'd have to go further right and deeper to follow the main vein. Clara went down to look for herself. Edmund was right. The section they'd been pulling from was approaching a pinch point, the dark, coal-bearing rock thinning between layers of gray granite. To the right, the chamber continued, lower ceilinged, and she could see the black vein continuing into the rock face 20 feet further in. It's accessible. But it would mean more work, a longer carry, and navigation through a section of tunnel she hadn't fully examined. She examined it now. She took the candle and went slowly, testing the ceiling with her hand, feeling the air movement, looking at the walls for the characteristics she'd learned to read the stability of the rock, the moisture patterns, anything that suggested a section under stress. Tunnel was tight but solid. The air moved through it in the way she'd come to recognize as healthy, upward, steady, the mountain's breath. She went back and told Edmund. We go right, she said. Start tomorrow. The vein's there, we just have to go get it. Edmund nodded. Then, how much longer do you think? Before the season breaks, Clara thought. She'd been tracking the temperature at the cave entrance each morning, pressing her bare hand to the stone and noting the quality of the cold. The way a person who pays close enough attention develops their own crude instruments. 3 weeks, she said. Maybe 4. It's turning. Slowly, but it's turning. And then people go home, Clara said. Or they go somewhere. Edmund looked at the tunnel wall. What about you? She hadn't fully answered that question for herself yet. She knew what she'd told Gerald Foss, that she was staying on the mountain. still believed that. But staying on the mountain when there were 9 people in the cave and 4 of them were from Ashvale Crossing was different from staying on the mountain alone with her mother. The mountain was becoming something she hadn't entirely planned. One thing at a time, she said. Edmund accepted this. He was a man who'd learned, in the past weeks, that Clara answered questions when she was ready to answer them, and not before, and that pushing served no one. The answer came from an unexpected direction. Ruth, Martha's daughter, the 14-year-old, who'd been hauling clay and tending Hester and watching everything with her careful dark eyes, came to Clara one afternoon with the journal. Not intrusively, not taking it without permission, she'd brought it over and held it out and said, "I read some of it. I hope that's all right." Clara looked at her. "What did you read?" "Part you wrote." "Not the old man's part. Your part." She held the journal carefully with both hands, the same way she carried the water pot, fireplace measurements, the tunnel, the bit about the cold wall. And Ruth's eyes were serious and entirely unself-conscious. "I think other people should read this. I think my mother should read it. I think people in the settlement should know this before next winter." Clara looked at this 14-year-old girl who had been scared since October and gone quiet, and then found her way to being useful, and then found her way to this standing in front of a woman twice her age, holding out a journal and saying, "I think this should go further." "Do you?" Clara said. "Yes." Ruth didn't hedge it. "People died. Not this winter, other winters." Gerald said so. "People died because they didn't know what to do. And you know what to do." She held the journal out a little further, a small insistent gesture. "Someone should make sure other people learn it." Clara took the journal back. She looked at it, at the trapper's cramped handwriting, and her own in the margins, and the oilcloth pages folded inside, at the accumulated knowledge of a dead man and a living woman layered over each other in the same small book. She thought about what Mabel had said weeks ago, in the early days of the cave. The difference between a roof and a home was intention. A roof keeps rain off. A home is something you make on purpose. She'd been thinking about that in terms of the physical space. The cave as home, not just shelter, but Ruth was pointing at something else, pointing at the journal and saying, "This is not just your roof. This is something you're making on purpose, and you made it bigger than you think." Clara didn't answer the girl directly. She said, "You're good with the cow." Ruth blinked. "Yes, and you learn quickly. You were moving coal efficiently by the 3rd day. I watched how Edmund did it. Watching is how you learn most things." Clara looked at her steadily. "How old are you?" 14. "When I was 14, I could rebuild a fence line and preserve a winter's worth of vegetables and navigate by stars." "Could you do any of those things?" Ruth considered. "The vegetables, maybe. My grandmother taught me some." "Then you have a start." Clara handed the journal back to her. "Read the rest of it. When you've finished, tell me what questions you have. If your questions are useful, I'll answer them." Ruth looked at the journal, then at Clara with the expression of someone who has been handed something heavier that's what they expected, and is recalculating their grip. "Why?" she said. "Because someone taught me," Clara said, "and because the information isn't useful to anyone if it dies in this cave." That evening, for the first time in 2 months, Clara sat by the fire and didn't work. She just sat. Her hands in her lap, palms up, scarred and clay-stained and cracked across the knuckles, the hands of a woman who had rebuilt a hearth and carried her mother up a mountain and held this cave together through the worst winter years. She sat with them open and looked at the fire. Around her, the cave breathed and lived. Edmund and Nell were talking quietly near the back passage entrance. Pete Cowan was mending a boot with the sinew thread they'd salvaged from the old bundle. Martha was asleep, her daughter sitting beside her, the journal open in Ruth's lap, her lips moving slightly as she read in the firelight. Gerald Foss was telling a story to Soren and Britta Hulst about the settlement's founding years. She could catch fragments of it. The names of people long dead, the shape of a place that had been something before it became what it was now, and might become something yet. Mabel was watching her from her blankets. When Clara looked over, the old woman smiled. Not the tired, careful smile of recent weeks, but the real one, the one that had been there since Clara's earliest memories, warm and a little crooked and completely without performance. "There," Mabel said softly. Exactly what she'd said on the first night when the fire caught. Clara looked back at the fire. Outside, the wind was doing what it always did. But there was something different in it tonight, a quality of exhaustion. as if the winter itself was beginning to run down, the cold losing a fraction of its absolute certainty. Maybe she was imagining it. Maybe she was hearing what she wanted to hear, but she didn't think so. She turned her hands over and laid them flat against her knees, the warmth of the fire reaching her face, the mountain breathing steady and slow beneath her, and she stayed there in the silence of a woman who had built something she hadn't known she was building, surrounded by people she hadn't expected to be responsible for, carrying a weight she had not asked and was not going to put down. The winter was turning. The wind changed on a Tuesday. Clara knew it before she could explain how she knew it. Something in the quality of the sound at the cave entrance, a frequency shift, the difference between wind that was pressing in and wind that was beginning, barely, to pull back. She'd been living Blackthorn Mountain, staying inside Blackthorn Mountain long enough that she'd develop a relationship with its, the way you develop a relationship with a person you live closely with it, not through analysis, but through accumulated exposure, through the body's slow learning of what each sound meant. She went to the entrance before dawn and shifted the stone and put her face into the outside air. It was still cold, seriously cold, the kind that made your sinuses ache on the first breath. But there was something underneath the cold that hadn't been there before, a faint suggestion of the cold's absolute authority beginning to negotiate rather than simply dictate. The sky above the tree line was a deep pre-dawn blue, and instead of the flat black of deep winter, and the stars had a slightly softened quality they got when moisture was returning to the upper air. 6 weeks, she'd told Edmund. Maybe 4. She'd been wrong in the right direction. It had been closer to 5. She went back inside and began heating water, and she let the others sleep for another hour, because sleep was still a resource she protected. And she sat in the growing warmth of the main chamber, with the journal in her lap and the coal fire burning its steady burn, and she thought about what came next. Mabel was still breathing. Clara checked this, the way she checked it every morning now, not with panic, but with the careful attention of someone monitoring something precious and fragile and declining in a direction that couldn't be reversed. Her mother had been sleeping more and eating less since the last week of January. She was present when she was awake, still sharp, still herself, stased, still capable of saying something in 12 words that took Clara an hour to fully understand. But the awake periods were shorter and the sleeping periods were longer, and the trajectory of it was something Clara had been looking at directly for 3 weeks without letting herself flinch away. She'd made her peace with what she couldn't change, or she was in the process of making it. She wasn't sure there was a version of this that arrived finished. When Mabel woke that morning, Clara was beside her. "Something's different," Mabel said. She hadn't opened her eyes yet, but her nostrils had moved, reading the air the way she'd always read things through channels other people didn't think to use. "Wind changed," Clara said. "Season's turning." Mabel opened her eyes. The gray-blue clarity was still there, still sharp, but the frame around it was tired in a bone-deep way. "How long? Before real thaw?" "Weeks still, but it's moving." Mabel nodded slowly. She looked at the ceiling of the cave, at the smoke-stained rock, at the mineral shimmer in the stone, at the crack through which the hearth's chimney rose and disappeared. She'd spent the last 2 months looking at that ceiling from her blankets. Clara had always wondered what she thought about when she looked at it. "I won't make it to spring," Mabel said. She said it the same way. She said everything true and difficult, not with drama, not with the performed weight of a person who wanted to be argued with, just plainly, as information. Clara's hands tightened in her lap. She kept her voice level. "You don't know that." "I know my body," Mabel said. "I've had it 70 years. I know what it's saying." She turned her head to look at her daughter. "I'm not afraid. I want you to hear that. I'm telling you not because I want you to fix it, but because I want you to be ready." "I'm not going to be ready," Clara said. Her voice came out harder than she meant. "There's no version where I'm ready for that." "No," Mabel agreed. "But you'll be less surprised. And with you, being less surprised is the same as being ready." She reached out and touched Clara's hand. Her fingers were thin now, the skin loose over the knuckles, but the grip had intention in it. "You know what you're doing. You've known for weeks, I think. Maybe since the first fire caught." Clara looked at their hands. Hers large and scarred and clay-stained, her mother's small and worn and still. She didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that did what the moment needed. So she held her mother's hand and sat in the warmth of what she'd built and let the morning come. Mabel died on a Thursday 11 days later. It happened in the early afternoon, which was not the time Clara would have predicted. She'd been half-braced for a night, for the particular cruelty of dawn without warning. Instead, it was the middle of an ordinary working day, the cave full of its usual sounds, Edmund in the back tunnel, Ruth reading near the fire, Pete Cowan at the entrance checking the weather, and Mabel simply stopped. Clara was beside her. She'd been beside her every afternoon since the wind changed, rearranging her days so that the mid-afternoon hours were her mother's. She was holding Mabel's hand when it happened, and she felt it the specific quality of a grip releasing, not in the way of sleep, but in the way of something completed. She sat with it for a long time before she said anything to anyone. When she finally stood up and turned around, Ruth was watching from across the cave. The girl read Clara's face and immediately went quiet and went to find Edmund, and within a few minutes, everyone in the cave knew without Clara having to say the words. They were all kind. That was the unexpected part, the quality of kindness that emerged from people who had spent months in close quarters with each other and had developed the rough affection of shared survival. Pete Cowan said nothing, but brought Clara hot water and set it beside her without touching her. Martha Lund sat nearby for an hour without speaking, which was exactly what was needed. Edmund and Nell worked with particular quietness in the back tunnel, staying occupied the way people stay occupied when they don't know what else to do, and understand that doing something is better than hovering. Ruth sat beside Clara when the others had moved away and said, "What do you need?" It was the right question. Not "I'm sorry," not "she's at peace now," not any of the phrases that people use to paper over the raw place where loss lives. Just, "What do you need?" "Nothing right now," Clara said. "Thank you for asking." She buried her mother in the sheltered alcove she'd found in the cave's western wall, a natural indentation in the rock, wide enough and deep enough, protected from the main chamber's activity by a curve in the wall. She moved the stone herself, working through the afternoon and into the evening by candlelight, clearing the floor and leveling the ground. Edmund offered to help. She shook her head. He understood and didn't offer again. She laid Mabel in the alcove with the wool coat over her, and her hands folded the way she'd always folded them in her lap, with that specific intention, not loosely but not tense either, the hands of a woman who'd spent 70 years managing things and had finally set them down. Clara covered the entrance with flat stones, fitted together carefully, sealed at the edges with clay. She pressed the last piece of clay into the last gap with her thumb and held it there for a moment. Then she stood up, brushed the stone dust from her hands, and went back to the fire. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the hearth, and she let herself feel all of it, the grief, the specific hollowness of a world that had removed someone from it who had been so fundamental that you'd stop noticing the fundamentalness of them. She felt it fully, and she didn't try to organize it or resolve it into something manageable. She just let it be what it was, which was enormous and ordinary, and the oldest human experience that existed, and she sat with it until the fire burned low, and she rebuilt it with fresh coal, and she sat with it some more. Sometime before dawn, she picked up the journal. She turned to a blank oilcloth page. She wrote, "Mabel Whitlock, born 1818, died in this mountain, in the warmth we built together." She knew about rationing and preservation, and the difference between strength and cruelty. She said the difference was this: strength does not require making someone else feel small. I'm writing this so I don't forget the exact words, because the exact words were the whole point. She looked at what she'd written. Then she wrote underneath it, "She was the reason I climbed this mountain. Not because I needed help, though I did, but because some things are only possible when you're carrying something that matters more than your own fear. I think that might be the most important thing I know. I haven't figured out yet what to do with it." She closed the journal and held it in her lap until the dawn came through the entrance gap, and the cave filled with its early gray light, and somewhere in Hester's corner the old cow shifted and made her. Morning sounds, and Clara sat in all of it and breathed. 3 weeks later, the trail opened. Not completely. There were still stretches of deep snow, still mornings that dropped below zero, still the need for serious winter clothing and careful footing. But the trail was passable. The decisive thaw hadn't arrived yet, but the season had turned far enough that you could move on it without risking the kind of cold that killed you in the open. People began making decisions about going back. Martha and Ruth left first. Martha embraced Clara before they left a real embrace, not the careful formal kind, and Clara received it without stiffening. Ruth had the journal's condensed guide in her coat pocket. The document Clara had spent 3 weeks refining into something a person could actually follow. She'd copied it twice more, in her own handwriting on paper. Martha had produced so there would be multiple versions that could go to multiple places. I'm going to show this to everyone who'll look at it, Ruth told Clara at the cave entrance. Good, Clara said. If they have questions, the answers are in the longer version. And the longer version doesn't answer something, then it means I forgot to write it down, and you should come back and ask me. Ruth looked at her with that serious-eyed steadiness. You'll be here? Gerald Foss left the following day with Pete Cowan. The two of them had developed an unlikely companionship. In the cave's later weeks, the old man who'd been in Asheville Crossing 30 years, and the quiet mill worker who'd lost his wife in October, finding in each other the easy company of people who'd both run out of things to perform. Gerald shook Clara's hand at the entrance, which she appreciated for its formality. It was the handshake of a man acknowledging an equal. Crowder's going to be a problem, he said. He's been a problem, Clara said. He's going to be a more organized problem. He's going to have had all winter to think about you surviving, and he's not going to have liked what he thought. Gerald held her gaze with his old clear eyes. I'll work on the council. Holt and Birch both owe me enough years of favors that they'll listen. But you need to come to town. Not to ask permission, you've got nothing to ask permission for. Just to exist in their line of sight as a person who's still here. I know, Clara said. They need to see that you're not a wound they can ignore healed over, he said. They need to see what you built. She thought about Mabel's words in the early days of the cave. That this is the difference between strength and cruelty. Strength does not require making someone else feel small. She thought about Crowder's face when he'd said burden. She thought about what she wanted to do with those two things existing in the same world. I'll come to town, she said once. Gerald nodded. That was enough for him. Soren and Britta Hulst left 3 days later. Britta embraced Nell and then, to Clara's slight surprise, embraced Clara too, a brief but genuine contact, the kind shared between people who'd been cold and afraid together and had come out the other side. Soren shook Clara's hand with both of his, which was more than a handshake, and Clara let it be what it was. Edmund and Nell were the last to go. They'd stayed to help with the final week of cave maintenance, the preparation for what Clara was already thinking of as its next iteration. The changes she wanted to make before the following winter, the improvements she'd identified over the long months of use. Edmund had become, by the end, genuinely skilled at the coal work. He knew the seam's behavior, knew how to read the rock for viable pulling versus wasted effort, knew the carries and the weights and the pacing required. On his last morning, he helped Clara build a secondary fire basin near the cave's western wall, a smaller hearth, simpler, designed to be lit independently of the main one, providing redundancy in case the main hearth ever needed repair. It was something she'd been planning for weeks. They worked on it together in the comfortable silence of people who'd figured out how to work together, no instruction needed, no explanations, just the shared task and the natural distribution of hands and effort. When it was done, Edmund stood back and looked at it, then at the main hearth, then at the sealed walls, at the alcove where Mabel rested, at the journal on its shelf, at the whole interior of the cave which had become, over 5 months, something that bore almost no resemblance to the dark gap in the rock that Clara had carried her mother into on a December night. What are you going to call it? He said. Clara looked at him. What? The cave. Place like this should have a name. Not Widowmaker Hollow. She'd been calling it Widowmaker Hollow in her own head since the beginning, and out of habit the name from Thomas's story, the name Marsh, had probably inherited from whoever told him about it. But Edmund was right that it wasn't that anymore. Whatever it had been when it was named for the men who died trying to reach it, it was something different now. She thought about it. Not for long. Haven Hollow, she said. Edmund nodded once. That's right, he said. And then he didn't say anything else about it, because it didn't need anything else said. Nell hugged Clara at the entrance. She was a woman who hugged without self-consciousness, and Clara had gotten used to it over the months, had stopped anticipating it with the slight internal bracing she'd applied to all physical contact when she'd still been in Asheville Crossing, where touch from other people often carried an assessment in it. Nell's didn't. It never had. "We'll be back next winter," Nell said. "If you'll have us." "I'll have you," Clara said. "You and your clay pot." Nell laughed a real laugh, unpretty and full, and then she and Edmund went down the slope and Clara stood at the entrance of Haven Hollow and watched them until the tree line took them. She was alone. She stood in the entrance for a long time. Not from uncertainty, she knew exactly what she was going to do and in what order she was going to do it. She'd been planning it for 2 weeks. She stood there because she wanted to feel the specific weight of the solitude, the silence, after 5 months of other people's breathing and movement and voices. She'd thought she might find it frightening. She found instead that it felt like the silence, after a long and difficult conversation, a silence that was full rather than empty, that had the texture of everything that had been said still present in it. Then she went back inside and got to work. The garden was her first project. She'd been thinking about it since week 4, when she'd started cataloging what the cave's environment could support: the light that came through the entrance gap in late morning, the consistent temperature in the main chamber, the rich mineral content of the tunnel clay. Not a full-growing operation, she wasn't under any illusions about what was possible at this altitude in this terrain. But hardy root vegetables, some herbs, perhaps a cold-tolerant leafy green or two, things that could extend their food independence past what stored supplies alone could manage. She terraced a section of the cave's southern wall, the side that caught the morning light, using flat stones to build 3 shallow planting beds. She mixed tunnel clay with ash from the fire basin, which she knew from her father's farm created a workable soil amendment. She didn't have seeds yet. That would require a trip to the settlement, which she'd planned for. But the beds were ready, and readiness was the preparation for what came after. She mapped the cave system more fully than she had before, taking 3 days to explore passages she'd avoided during the winter because the risk-to-return ratio hadn't justified them. What she found surprised her. Cave system was larger than she'd understood. The right-side passages beyond the coal seam connected, eventually, to a third chamber she'd never reached, smaller than the main 2, but with a floor so flat it seemed almost worked, and a ceiling crack that let in a thin column of gray skylight at midday. Natural skylight. She stood in it and looked up through the crack at the pale blue of early March sky and felt something that wasn't quite wonder and wasn't quite satisfaction and was maybe just the recognition of a thing that exceeded your expectations in a direction you didn't expect. She recorded all of it in the journal. She had started in those first solo days to think about the journal differently. Not as a record she was keeping, but as a document she was building, something with a destination, something that was going toward people rather than staying inside a cave. Ruth had given her that reframing without knowing she'd given it, and the more Clara sat with it, the more she understood what the journal actually was. It was an argument, not a combative argument, not against anything or anyone specifically. An argument in the older sense, a sustained case for something. A case that survival was possible for people who'd been told they wouldn't survive. Case that intelligence and attention and refusal to stop were more useful resources than status or approval. A case that the strongest person in any given winter might be someone that everyone around them had massively underestimated. She wrote a new section at the front of the document on a fresh oilcloth page she'd made from the last good piece of the original wrapping, not instructions. Something else. She wrote, "If you found this book, you found it because you're in a situation that someone told you couldn't be survived. I was in that situation once. What I want to tell you before the measurements and the chimney ratios and the coal identification and all the rest of it is this: the people who told you it couldn't be survived were not calculating your actual capacities. They were calculating what they assumed your capacities to be, which is a different thing entirely. The assumptions were wrong. Start there." She read it back. It wasn't perfect. The second sentence was too long and the last line was too abrupt. But it was honest, and honest was what mattered more. She went to Ashvale Crossing on a Wednesday in mid-March. The trail was genuinely passable now, cold still, with ice in the shaded sections and mud beginning to develop where the sun hit the southern exposures, the particular unpleasant transitional state of a thaw in progress. She left before first light and moved at her pace, which was steady and not fast. She brought nothing with her except the journal in her coat and the hand axe in her belt, because she was not going to the settlement to bring them anything. She was going for the reason Gerald had articulated, to exist in their line of sight as a person who was still here. The settlement looked different than she'd expected. She'd expected poverty. She'd expected the specific look of a place that had spent a hard winter reducing itself to what it absolutely needed. And that was there in the patched and repatched clothing on the people she passed, in the depleted look of the woodpiles by the cabins, in the quietness of a settlement that had lost some of the comfortable noise of a well-fed winter community. But she'd also expected something smaller, somehow a diminished thing. What she found instead was a place that looked like it had been through something and was still standing, which was its own kind of fact. People saw her. The recognition moved through the settlement ahead of her, like a ripple. She could see it in the way people who'd been talking stopped, in the way a woman hanging laundry on a rope between two buildings paused with a shirt in her hands and watched. She walked the main track through the settlement at the same pace she'd walked everything for the past 5 months, steady, unhurried, entirely present. She wasn't looking for Crowder. She didn't need to find him. He found her. He came around the corner of the general store and stopped when he saw her, and for a moment the two of them simply occupied the same space, the chairman of the town council and the widow he'd sent to die in December. He looked different than she remembered. Not smaller, exactly, but less absolute. The winter had taken something from his certainty that she suspected he hadn't known he was risking. She watched him calculate, watched him try to find the angle that returned them to the dynamic he'd established in her cabin doorway, the one where he was the authority, and she was the problem to be managed. She could see him looking for it, the way you look for something you've misplaced systematically, then with increasing unease. He didn't find it, because it wasn't there anymore. Whatever position he'd held over her had depended on her needing something from Ashvale Crossing, and she didn't need anything from Ashvale Crossing. She looked at him. Not with hatred, she'd examined her hatred for Silas Crowder during the long evenings of the cave and found that it had spent itself. What she felt instead was something colder and more useful, a complete clarity about who he was and what he'd done and what it meant. He was a man who had used a small amount of power to harm people he'd decided didn't matter, and the winter had demonstrated, at considerable cost to everyone involved, that his assessment was wrong. That was all. That was the whole of it. She held his gaze for 5 seconds. Then she walked past him. She felt him turn to watch her go, and she did not look back. She walked to the other end of the settlement's main track, and she stood for a moment, looking at the approach the directions of her old cabin, which she did not walk toward. There was nothing there she needed. She turned and walked back through the settlement the way she'd come, and people watched, and she let them watch. Gerald found her near the settlement's edge, where the main track curved toward the tree line. "Council meeting's Friday," he said, falling into step beside her without preamble. "Holt and Birch have both committed to supporting a revision of Article 9. Not elimination, Crowder will fight that, but modification. A provision that surviving spouses of either sex retain property rights for a minimum period of 2 years. 2 years isn't enough," Clara said, "no. But it's a start that can be extended, and it's better than nothing, which is what it is now." He paused. "Will you come to the meeting?" She thought about this. She thought about sitting in a room with Silas Crowder and making arguments to men who had voted against her in December. She thought about what it would cost, and whether the cost was worth what the outcome might be. "Send me the outcome," she said. "I'll read it." Gerald looked at her. "You're not going to fight for it in the room?" "I fought all winter," Clara said. "I did it on a mountain without anyone's permission or support. The council can make a decision without me in the room. If they make the right one, it's because the evidence was sufficient, and Gerald Foss talked sense into the right people. If they make the wrong one..." She stopped. "If they make the wrong one, then women like me will keep doing what I did. Building without permission, surviving without support. And eventually, the wrong decision will become so obviously wrong that even Crowder won't be able to hold it up." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "That's a patient position." "I buried my mother in that mountain," Clara said. "Patience is what I have." He nodded slowly. They walked a few more steps. "The journal," he said. "Ruth's been talking about it. Her copy is already going around. I saw Birch reading it." "Good. People want more copies. Then they should make them." Copy costs nothing but time. Some people are calling it, he paused, choosing his words. People are starting to call it the Hollow Guide. Informal, but it's spreading. Clara said nothing to this. She didn't know what to do with the information, so she held it the same way she held things she hadn't yet categorized, without forcing it into a shape it hadn't chosen yet. At the edge of the settlement, she and Gerald stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for what you're doing in there. Thank you," he said, "for not letting us watch you die." She looked at him. Old man with his hollow cheeks filled out a little now, the 30-year resident of a settlement that had treated him like furniture for most of those years. Something between them acknowledged the other without requiring a name for it, turned and went back up the mountain. The spring came unevenly, the way it always does in high country, 3 warm days followed by a cold snap, then warm again, then a late snow that lasted 48 hours and then melted faster than it had fallen. Clara moved through it all without urgency. She'd learned over the winter that urgency was a resource, like coal or flour. You used it when it was the right tool, and you conserved it when it wasn't, because burning through it unnecessarily left you without it when you actually needed it. She planted in late April, seeds she'd brought from the settlement on her one trip down, not bought, exactly. Ruth had organized a kind of collection among the people who'd sheltered in the cave, a voluntary contribution of seeds that various households could spare. It arrived at the cave entrance one morning tied in a cloth, left there while Clara was in the back tunnel. No note attached, but its meaning entirely clear. She planted them in the terraced beds along and watered them from the southern wall, and watered them from the seep, them with the patient attention of someone who had learned that patience was not a passivity, it was the discipline of letting things develop at their own pace, while you did everything in your power to support the conditions for their development. The first green shoots came up in May, small, tentative, the specific pale yellow-green of plants finding their first light. She crouched beside the terraced beds and looked at them for a long time. She didn't make anything large of it, but she wrote it in the journal. First growth. May, the beds work. Nell and Edmund came back in June as Nell had promised. They didn't come alone. They brought a family called the Wests, a couple with 2 half-grown children who'd been burned out of their own claim and needed somewhere to stabilize before they could rebuild. Clara assessed the family with the frank efficiency she'd developed over the winter, not unkindly, but honestly, looking for what they had and what they needed, and whether the cave could provide the latter without losing the former, and she took them in, and she showed them what Haven Hollow was, and how it worked. The Wests' older child, a boy of 16 named Clem, was the first person who looked at the cave with eyes that Clara recognized from a specific memory, her own eyes, on the first night she'd found the trapper's hearth. The eyes of someone realizing that a thing could be understood and therefore could be learned. Most of its windows were dark. She watched him read Marsh's section of the journal without prompting, moving his lips slightly, going back over the technical passages twice. She watched him look at the hearth, and then at the chimney crack, and then at the diagrams she'd drawn in the margins. "The angle," he said. "That's the whole thing, isn't it? The angle of the opening, and the height of the opening relative to the width," Clara said. They worked together. He looked at the hearth. "Could you build this anywhere that has a natural chimney? Anywhere that has the right geological conditions, yes. You need upward air movement from below thermal activity of some kind. You can't create that. You can only find it and use it. How do you find it?" She showed him what she knew. How to feel for air movement in the ground-level rock. How to read the temperature differential between surface air and cave air. How to identify coal deposits from wall coloration. All the things she'd learned through trial and exhaustion and error and starting over, condensed now into transmittable knowledge, the kind that could move from one person to another and arrive useful at the other end. Teaching it was different from knowing it. She'd known this abstractly, that teaching forced you to understand your own knowledge in a new way, but experiencing it was something else. Questions Clem asked revealed the gaps she hadn't known she had, the places where she'd been operating on instinct she'd developed through practice and hadn't yet converted into language anyone else could follow. She went back and added sections to the journal, revised 2 passages that she'd, assuming the reader knew things they probably didn't know. The journal was becoming something larger than itself. By late summer, Haven Hollow had housed, in various capacities and durations, 23 people across 8 separate families or individuals. Not all at once, Clara managed the population carefully, the way the cave's resources required, and never taking in more than the thermal and food situation could support. But sequentially, continuously, a living shelter that moved people through difficulty and back out the other side. She developed a system. Not formal, not rigid, a system the way a working tool is a system, shaped by use and refined by feedback, and modified wherever it didn't fit. People who stayed contributed labor calibrated to their capacity. People who left took knowledge with them, copies of the guide, or portions of it, or the specific skills they developed during their stay. The knowledge spread the way practical knowledge spreads, person to person, modification by modification, each recipient changing it slightly based on their own experience and passing that version forward. She heard of its windows were dark. She heard from Edmund in September that 3 settlements in the region were building winter shelters based on Haven Hollow's principles. Not caves, the geology wasn't right everywhere, and the guide was explicit about that. But the thermal principles were being applied to above-ground structures, hearth designs that used the mountain air's natural convection, wall sealing techniques adapted to log cabin construction, coal identification knowledge being used to locate fuel sources that previous settlers hadn't known to look for. The Hollow Guide, people were calling it. She heard this from 3 separate sources before she believed it was real. The council revision passed in October. Gerald sent word through Edmund. Article 9 now included a 2-year retention period for surviving spouses. Not enough. She'd said so when she heard about the initial proposal, and she still believed it. But it was a change that hadn't existed before, and it was a change that had a direction, and directions mattered as much as distances. She didn't celebrate it. She wrote it in the journal, Article 9, revised, October. 2-year provision. Not sufficient, but moving and kept working. Crowder's response came not through any formal channel, but through the specific silence that powerful men use when they've lost a point they didn't expect to lose. He didn't try to reverse the revision. He didn't make public statements about Clara or Haven Hollow. He simply became quieter on those subjects, which Gerald interpreted as the early stages of a man recognizing that he had miscalculated something and needing time to develop a new position. Clara received this information without satisfaction and without concern. Crowder's internal recalculations were his own business. By the time the second winter arrived, Clara had the cave prepared in ways she couldn't have imagined the first time. The terraced beds had been harvested and their soil amended and replanted with cold-tolerant varieties for the winter growing season. The coal seam's right-side extension had been fully opened and mapped, revealing a reserve that her best estimate put at 3 to 5 years of heavy use. The secondary fire basin was functioning and had been tested through a cold snap. The entrance had been improved substantially, a proper stone and mortar structure with a wooden door. She'd built from timber over 3 weeks, heavy enough to hold heat in but operable from both sides. And the journal had become a book. She'd been adding to it steadily through the summer, organizing it from the rough marginal note collection it had been into something structured. Trapper Marsh's original entries occupied a dedicated section with her commentary alongside each entry, providing context and correction where her experience had updated his. Her own winter survival section was organized by category: shelter construction, fuel sources, water, food preservation, temperature management, medical considerations, the social dynamics of group survival in confined conditions, which had turned out to be its own entire subject. And the section she'd added at the front, the one that began with the line about assumptions, had been rewritten 4 times until it said what she actually meant. Most of its windows were dark, and what she actually meant was something she'd been working toward understanding since the night she'd carried Mabel through the cave entrance. The book was Marsh's and hers and Mabel's, in that order and together. Marsh had found the place and understood its potential and recorded what he knew. Mabel had brought decades of preservation knowledge and the specific wisdom of a woman who'd spent a lifetime managing difficulty with intelligence and without complaint, and had something essential to say about the difference between strength and cruelty. Clara had rebuilt what Marsh built, added what Mabel knew, discovered what neither of them had known, and written it all down in a form other people could use. She thought sometimes about what Thomas would have made of it, not often. Grief was not a place she lived anymore. It was a place she passed through occasionally, the way you pass through a town you used to live in, aware of everything that's both changed and unchanged, able to keep moving without stopping. Thomas had loved her in the straightforward way of a man who'd seen her clearly and chosen what he saw, and that was real. And it was gone, and both things were true. What she had now was different from what she'd had with Thomas, and not less than it. It was the particular fullness of a life that had been stripped to nothing and then rebuilt deliberately, piece by piece, in full knowledge of its own fragility. A life that knew it could be lost because it had been lost and had decided to be fully itself anyway. She was 30 years old. She had buried her husband in a settlement that then took her home. She had carried her mother up a mountain in the dark. She had built a fire inside a dead man's hearth and watched the smoke go the right way. She had held a cave full of people together through the worst winter in a generation. She had written down everything she knew and let it go forward into the world to do what it could. She had never asked anyone's permission for any of it. On the first morning of the second winter, she went to the cave entrance before dawn and opened the door she'd built and stood in the cold outside air with her face turned up to the sky. Stars were out, sharp and high, the particular clarity of a cold that had just arrived and not yet settled into itself. Blackthorn Mountain was still around her, its weight and its depth, and its warmth below, unchanged. She put her hand flat against the stone beside the entrance, the rock she'd pressed her forehead against on those first nights when the cold had been the only real thing, and she held it there. The stone was cold on the surface, and something else underneath, something that moved upward from the mountain's deep interior, that had been moving upward since long before anyone gave this mountain a name or decided who was and wasn't worth saving from its weather. She went back inside. The fire in the main hearth had burned down to coals during the night. This was normal. This was managed. She'd calibrated the coal load before sleep to arrive at exactly this point, ready to be built back up. She added fresh coal from the bin Edmund had helped her construct against the eastern wall. She arranged it the way she'd learned coal needed to be arranged, not piled, but positioned, with deliberate air channels between the pieces, the specific geometry of combustion that the trapper's journal had begun and her own months of trial had refined. She struck the flint. The spark caught. She watched it for a moment, the small flame moving across the coal surface, finding the channels she'd made for it, spreading in the direction she'd designed for it to spread. The draft caught. The chimney pulled, and the warmth began to build in the way she knew it would build, gradually, steadily, with the reliability of a thing that had been understood and applied correctly. The mountain breathed upward through its fissures. The fire added its heat to the mountain's heat. The chamber filled with warmth that was layered and complex, and, to anyone who hadn't built it and didn't know what had gone into it, might have seemed like something that had simply always been there. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at the hearth she'd built. She thought about Mabel, in the alcove behind the western wall. She thought about Marsh, who'd found this place alone and lived in it alone and left his knowledge in a sealed oilcloth bundle for whoever came next, not knowing who that would be or when. She thought about Ruth, somewhere in Ashvale Crossing, reading the journal by candlelight. About Edmund and Nell on their claim, building the winter shelter they'd told her about, using the hearth dimensions from the guide. About Gerald Foss in a council meeting, making the case with the patience of a man who had 30 years of practice at being ignored and had decided to stop letting it slow him down. Yet, who would find their way to Haven Hollow or to the guide or to the knowledge in some form she couldn't predict in winters she wouldn't live to see. The fire settled into itself, steady warm, burning with the low, even sound of coal that had been placed correctly in a hearth that had been built correctly inside a mountain that had always had this warmth in it, waiting for someone to figure out how to use it. Clara picked up the journal from its shelf. She turned to the last written page and found the space beneath the last line she'd written, and she picked up the charcoal stick and she wrote, "Second winter. The fire is burning. The door holds. The garden beds are ready. Someone will come up the trail in a few weeks, or a few months, and they will knock on the door or call from the entrance, and I will let them in. I don't know who they will be. I don't know what they will need. But I know this cave, and I know this mountain, and I know what I have built here, and it will be enough. It has always been enough." The only thing that was ever wrong was other people's accounting. She paused. Read back what she'd written. The handwriting was steadier than it had been in December. The charcoal marks were more deliberate, more even. The hand of a woman who had been doing this long enough to have grown into it. She wrote one more line underneath. Her name was Mabel Whitlock, and she knew the difference between a roof and a home. This one is for her. She closed the journal. The fire burned on inside Haven Hollow, inside the mountain that the dead trapper had found and the living widow had rebuilt, and the warmth moved through the chamber the way it had always moved upward, steady, from somewhere deep in the rock where the cold could not reach. Outside, the second winter settled over Blackthorn Mountain. Inside, the fire held,